pressure to show your creativity is on. From your boss, from your family, even from your audience. But don't panic. Just reach for Total Training. And let our industry insiders help you get the most from your creative software. With Total Training's video instruction on CD-ROM and DVD, it's like having your own personal software instructors, whenever and wherever you need them. Whether you're in the office, at home, or on the road, leading experts are at your side. Like best-selling author Deke McClellan, who'll help your documents shine. Or acclaimed motion graphics guru Brian Maffitt will make your videos sizzle. And award-winning designer Steve Holmes to give you the confidence to impress any audience. To give you more confidence in Total Training, all our products come with a money-back guarantee. Because we know our training will help make you a hero to the people who count most. So go away knowing you can trust Total Training, the fastest, easiest way to get the most out of your software. To order or for more information about any of Total Training's industry-leading products, call our toll-free number or visit our website today.
Welcome to the world of Total Training. If you're watching this video, you've probably already made the decision to expand your skills and improve your productivity. Well, I'm here to assure you you've come to the right place. I'm Brian Maffitt, a company founder and a regular presenter in our training series. Total Training is the leading provider of video-based software instruction, with a special focus on Adobe's products, although we offer training for other types of software as well. For those of you who have seen one of our series before, you know that Total Training offers the highest quality, most engaging, and most effective instruction available anywhere. But what makes our products unique? Not only does video training offer many advantages over other types of instruction, higher retention because you're seeing the software in action, the ability to return to specific lessons as needed, relatively low cost, to name just a few, but we also employ techniques that really make us stand head and shoulders above the rest. First and foremost, we use only the best presenters, all proven experts in their fields, and each with a knack for walking users through the software in both an instructive and entertaining manner. Second, every Total Training series ships with the very same project files that the presenter uses in the training, so you can follow along with your copy of the software as you watch to really get the full learning experience. And finally, we're extremely thorough and always engaging. Our series are designed to help you learn at your own pace, with lessons you can easily understand, apply, and most importantly, remember. But you don't have to take my word for it. We have packed this CD full of examples taken straight from the series themselves. We've also included sample project files so you can work along with the demos and truly get a feel for what the Total Training experience is like. You can click a button on the screen to install the full set of sample project files onto your computer, or just sit back and watch the training. If you'd like to purchase any of our series, or if you have any questions about our products, call 888-368-6825, or check us out online at www.totaltraining.com. So use one of the buttons below to delve into our software training series for print and web, dynamic media, or document management. We want to help you scale the loftiest heights that your profession has to offer. Let's get started. Pick a button, any button. They're all nice, folks. Pick one. It's all you. Total Training focuses on delivering the greatest training experience available, and that includes the greatest accessibility to our products. In that spirit, we offer preferred pricing for our customers in government and education. You can take a look at these special programs on the Total Training website or call 888-368-6825 for more information. In order to provide our customers with the best purchasing experience, we're also always eager to build and support our reseller channel. With Total Training products as a perfect complement to Adobe software sales, resellers immediately enjoy incremental revenue and upsell opportunities. If you're interested in becoming a reseller for Total Training, contact Phil Simpson at 888-368-6825. And to get just another peek at what Total Training is all about, click the Play Commercial button on the next screen to take a look at our video ad. We think it's pretty fun and hope you'll enjoy it as well. These buttons at the top right of the screen tell you which lesson I'm in at any given time. And these buttons down the side tell you which topics we're working on within that lesson. You can press these buttons at any time to change the topic, go back to things you missed, or skip forward to stuff you can't wait to learn. These buttons here will give you more information about Adobe and its products, Total Training, and all of our video training series, as well as take you to the Total Training website. Finally, down below, you'll see tricks and tips that will enhance the lessons even further, as well as other training-related information. When Adobe released its Creative Suite package of web and print software, Total Training was again far ahead of the pack, delivering comprehensive training series for each of the applications as soon as they hit the shelves. In addition to being first on the scene, these series exemplified the thoroughness and entertainment value for which Total Training has become known. In fact, Adobe has so much faith in our training that they include a sample Total Training disc in the box of every Creative Suite application shipped. But let the series speak for themselves. Click any of the small buttons below to experience short lesson samples from each of our Creative Suite series. We'll let you know the project files you'll need to open at the beginning of each clip if you'd like to follow along, as you would in the full version of the training. All of the series in this section are presented by either Deke McClelland or Steve Holmes, who each bring their own brand of knowledge, insight, and personality to the lessons. I'm confident you'll enjoy them.
In Illustrator, some effects are static and others are dynamic. What's the difference? Well, unfortunately, the answer is very technical, which means I can only explain it in a poem. With static effects, once applied, they are dry. But dynamic effects can change on the fly. What was wheat becomes rye. What was tea becomes chai. What was French becomes fry. Who will teach you? That be I. So for our look at live effects, I'd like you to open circle.ai. I'd like you to open that up. That's the one we're going to be working in. And then there's this one here, which shows us the final effect. And it's not Spirogyros like the band. It's not that. It's Spirogyros. It's like the dish that you'd order at one of your finer restaurants. In any case, it's got all this sort of spirograph stuff going on. But here's the thing. Now you think, wow, this is really cool. We're going to get to create this, right, Deacon? That's true. So you guessed that part right. But here's the other thing. It's just a circle. That's all it is. This isn't a complex drawing. I didn't get the pen tool and spend 19 hours drawing all this weird stuff here. It's just one circle. That's it. One circle. I'm going to press Command Y or Control Y on the PC, and there it is. See? In the wireframe mode, that's all it is. It's just a circle. Watch this. I'll select the circle and I'll delete it. And I'll press Command Y or Control Y again, and we're just left with the radial gradient. That's all that's left. See? I'll undo that deletion. And back comes this universe of stuff here. And this is the kind of stuff that you can do in Illustrator using live effects. Want to do it? Okay. I want you to bring up the circle.ai document right here. And notice that I have spun open the circle layer here inside the layers palette. And inside there, you'll see an object called circle. I want you to select it. Just go ahead and click on the meatball if you want to, or you can just click on the circle item here with the arrow tool. And notice that currently it's got a black stroke and no fill whatsoever. Meanwhile, behind it is a backdrop that contains a single path. I didn't bother to name that one. It's just a square filled with a radial gradient, and that's just our backdrop here. If you want to take a look at that, go ahead and target it, go to the gradient palette, see how it's put together. That's not what we're going to focus on right now, though. Right now, we're going to focus on live effects. And to create live effects, the clearinghouse for live effects is the appearance palette. So go ahead and bring up the appearance palette, and sure enough, we've got a path selected, which is our circle, and it's got a 1-point stroke and no fill whatsoever. We are never going to add a fill to the shape. The whole time, it's going to have no fill. It's just going to have a bunch of strokes. So go ahead and click on the stroke item here inside the appearance palette to highlight it. Now, the first stroke, the one that we're going to start with, is sort of this light blue dashed stroke. Now, I don't know if you were able to parse all those strokes that were going on inside that live effect that we just saw, inside the other document. The simplest one is kind of a light blue dash stroke. So that's the one that we're going to start with here. So I'm going to start by setting the color of this item, and it's just 50% cyan, turns out. You can do any colors you want. Don't be constrained by what I'm doing. I just got this cool blue thing going. I'm going to set it to 50% cyan, and that's it. Nothing else. And then I'm going to set the stroke weight to 2 points. Feel free to go your own way there, too. And I'm going to create a dashed line that has a 6-point dash and a 2-point gap. That's perfect. I love that. That's exactly what I want. And then the other thing that I want to do, just to darken things up a little bit, I'm going to go to the transparency palette and set this stroke to the multiply mode. And I'm also going to press Command-H or Control-H over on the PC to get rid of that selection outline so we can just see what's happening with the stroke. So far, so good. Now, let's start getting some of that spirograph stuff going on. And the way that you do that is to go up to the Effect menu where many of the live effects live. They certainly don't live in the Filter menu. You rarely want to go there. There's a few useful commands there, but if you want to go with live effects, you go to the Effect menu, and then I want you to choose Distort and Transform, and then I want you to choose Transform. And that's going to bring up this big old dialog box here. Now, I'm going to transform this object so it's kind of a little bit elliptical instead of being circular like it is right now. So I'm going to set the horizontal scale to 36%, and I'm also going to rotate this 15 degrees. Around the center point, notice right there we have where the origin of this transformation is going to occur. We can also reflect the shape and all this other stuff if we want to. No point in doing that right now. And you have some random controls if you want Illustrator to add some random variations to your effect. I don't want that for this, but you can. And then click Preview to see what's going to happen. So here's what this looks like after this 15-degree rotation and 36% horizontal scaling is applied. So it's just squished and slightly rotated. No big deal, right? Very, very little going on here. I'll click OK. Now, here's the thing. I'll press Command-Y or Control-Y on the PC. It's still a circle. We haven't done anything to this object. This is a live effect that's being applied on top of this object inside the preview mode. So this is the way it's going to preview, this is the way it's going to print, and so on. And if I press Command-H or Control-H on the PC, you can see this selection outline is still the way it always was. Command-H, Control-H again. So far, so good. Now we want to apply yet another transformation. The reason being the transform command, that transform effect there, allows you to apply multiple copies of a transformed object. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'll go ahead and twirl open this stroke item so that we can see the items that we're adding here. I'm going to go up to the Effect menu once again, and notice that the first command allows us to reapply the last transformation we just got done applying. Don't want to do that. But the next command allows us to once again enter the Transform dialog box and apply yet another transform effect. Now, the second I choose this command, I'm going to be warned that this command doesn't allow you to edit the transform effect that you've already applied. If we wanted to edit the existing transform effect, we would double-click on this transform item here inside the Appearance palette. Instead, what we're going to do is heap on another transform effect. Is that what you want to do? The answer is don't ever tell me this again, and yes, apply a new effect, because we do want to heap on more effects here. This time, I'm going to keep the scale at 100% because we don't want to edit the scale anymore, because bear in mind, these are cumulative, so we don't want to keep scaling the object over and over, but we do want to keep rotating it over and over. So I'm going to change the rotate value to 30 degrees, And let's preview what happens with a 30-degree rotation. It just spins a little more, right? And you go, gosh, well, I could have just changed that in the previous application of transform. But now we're going to add 5 copies. Look at that. Just by virtue of the fact we add 5 copies, we start getting a bunch of different spirography things going on. So that 15-degree rotation that we applied at the first just set the angle of our first application of the shape. And then after that, we set up the additional shapes that we want to create. So this kind of duplicatory transform thing works really well for creating these types of effects. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And that is our first stroke. Aha, but that's not nearly enough, is it? So let's add another stroke. You may remember that wonderful keystroke that can do that new stroke. And that's Command-Option/, or Control-Alt/, on the PC, of course. And notice what we end up getting is this new stroke. Actually, it's a copy of the same stroke, but without the live effects. So we just get the dashes and the color and all that jazz, but we don't get the live effects. So what I want you to do now, let's change the color of this one to white. And I'm going to change the stroke weight to 6-point stroke. And instead of applying the standard butt cap, we want to apply the round cap. And the reason is, normally caps on strokes only affect the endpoints. However, when you have dashes going, the end of every single dash is treated as an endpoint. So notice what happens here. The entire line turns solid, and that's because the gaps aren't big enough. So I'll make the gaps bigger. I'll make 10-point gaps here. Now we get these sort of rounded edges around every single one of these dashes. And if you want perfectly circular dashes, then you change the dash value to 0. How weird is that? Pretty weird, but it still works very nicely. So there it is. We've got this kind of groovy stroke already going, but it's going to get much groovier. So I'm going to go up to the Effect menu, and once again, I'm going to choose that Transform command. And you may want to use the keyboard equivalent on this, which is mash down your palm and press E. So it's Command-Shift-Option-E or Control-Shift-Alt-E on the PC. It's up to you. Anyway, I'm going to choose the Transform command. It's going to bring up this dialog box once again. Now this time, I'm going to change the horizontal value to 36%. Boy, that's familiar. But I'm not going to rotate this at all. So I'm going to do no angle for the rotation and no copies, just 0. Okay, so we don't want any copies. In other words, you don't say 1 for just one version of it. 1 copy gets you 2 versions. You get that, right? So 0 copies gets you 1 version. Might not make sense, but there it is. And I'm going to click on the preview checkbox so we can see that. All right, so there you go. So this is why I rotated the first one 15 degrees on that first stroke. So these guys are kind of out of kilter with each other, which is what I want. Out of kilter is good. Okay, so I click OK. So that's my first application of this transformation here. Make sure that stroke is active, just so I'm making sure I'm applying this specifically to this stroke, not to all the strokes at once. Now I'm going to reapply transform. Once again, I'm going to choose a new application of the transform effect. Now this is cumulative. This is going to be heaped on top of the last one. So I'm going to change the horizontal value to 100%. Leave that alone. I'm going to change the rotate value to 30 degrees. And I'm going to change the number of copies value to 5. Now you might say, hey, Deke, that's pretty darn familiar. That's exactly the same thing we applied before. Yes, it is. I'm going to click on Preview so that we can see that occur, see him whip around in circles there, and that's great. That's exactly what I want. But wait a second. Even though this is exactly what I want, I'm going to click Cancel because we already did it before. I'll go ahead and twirl open that previous stroke. Recall that the second application of the transform effect was the exact same thing I just got done entering. So I can duplicate it. I can actually grab it, drag it up to this position in the stroke so that it's at the right location. I'll press the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and release. And that duplicates this transform to this location here. So you can do that kind of thing if you want to. You can duplicate these effects between objects and so on and so on. But we're going to apply one more layer. We keep upping the ante as we move through this lesson, by the way. I'm going to apply one more layer of effect inside the appearance palette here. So make sure this stroke is active. Go ahead and click on it to make it active. Then I'm going to go up to the Effect menu one more time and choose Transform again. And this time now it's bringing up the last applied settings. Note that. So it didn't keep those last settings I entered because I canceled. So it brought up the first settings. I'm going to change the horizontal value to 90 and the vertical value to 90% as well. So I'm going to reduce it proportionally by 90%. I'm going to change the angle value to 15 degrees, and I'm going to enter 4 copies this time. Now, this may not seem like many copies, but keep in mind this is cumulative. So I'm making 4 copies of everything that we're seeing right now, and click Preview. And so we get a lot. All right, and I'd say that's enough of that, because it gets any thicker than that, we got a snowstorm. So I'll just go ahead and click OK. So far, so good. The only thing is that I want this stroke in back of the previous stroke. I want the blue dashes in front of the white dashes. So I'm going to drag this stroke inside the appearance palette here up on top. So it's going to be in front, and the whites are going to be in back. I'll go back to our first spirograph here just so we can see it. Notice that every single one of these white splotches has sort of a halo of blue around it, so they're all traced. How do we do that? Well, this is very, very easy, it turns out. Once we've gotten to this point, I can just make a duplicate of this stroke right here. And the way I'm going to make a duplicate of this stroke is I'm going to drag it onto this little new page icon so that I get all the effects intact as well. So I want to make sure that I've got all these different effects going on. So I've made a complete duplicate of this stroke. Now I'm going to target the rear one because I want to create this new pattern in back of the old one. So I'm going to change the color this time to a fairly dark blue, 75% cyan, and tab, 50% magenta. Press the return key or the enter key on the PC. Now we're not seeing any difference here because it's in back of the white stroke. So let's see a difference by increasing the stroke weight to 8 points. Now, bear in mind, since we have an 8-point stroke with a 6-point stroke in front of it, that means the 8-point stroke is tracing all the way around, so we actually have a 1-point stroke around. That's the effect of it. There's actually a 2-point difference, I know, between 8 and 6, but 1 point's on one side and 1 point's on the other side. So that's how it ends up working. You take that difference, you divide it by 2. And that's it. We've got a dead match because we don't have to change any of those other transform effects because they exactly match the previous transform effect. So this is splendid. This is exactly what I want. Now for my next stroke, I'm just going to create yet another copy of one of these. This next stroke isn't going to bear that close a resemblance to the previous ones, but I'm still going to work from this stroke right here. So I'm going to drag it down onto the little new icon to duplicate it. And I'll go ahead and leave this one selected. This is the one I'm going to change, and that way it'll be sandwiched between the white stroke and the dark blue stroke. And I'm going to change the color of this stroke to more of a cyan color. So I'm going to increase the cyan value to 100% and reduce the magenta value to 20%, and then press return or enter on the PC there. And I'm going to reduce the weight a lot. This is going to be this little teeny filigree line here. And I'm going to turn off the dash. So get rid of the dash. It can be rounded caps. It really doesn't matter. You can change it back to the butt cap if you want to. So next, I'm going to twirl open this stroke so that we can see that it's got 3 layers of transform on it already. Now, I'm going to change every one of these. Rather than heaping on new transform effects, I'm just going to change the ones I already have. If you want to modify a live effect that's already applied to an object, you go to the appearance palette, you find that effect, and then you double-click on it to bring up the dialog box for that effect. So here we see the current horizontal scale value is 36%. I'm going to take it down to 8%, so it's really, really going to get thin. I'm going to change the rotate value to 15 degrees, and that's basically it. I can preview it if I want to, and we can see these little teeny lines going in the background here. I'll move this over so we can see it. See these little teeny guys going back and forth? Okay, that's what's happening right now. And I'll press the return key or the enter key on the PC to accept that modification. Now I'm going to double click on this second transform where we're replicating this shape over and over again. And I'm going to reduce the angle value to 10, and I'm going to increase the copies value to 18. 18 copies times 10 degrees ends up getting you a 180-degree rotation. So that takes you around half a circle, which is good enough because the ellipse goes on both sides of the center point. So if you went any more than 180 degrees, you'd be wasting your time. You'd be doubling up. So you can click on preview if you want to see that effect get applied. And you can see now we have very, very dense coverage in this area. Now I'll click OK. And finally, go ahead and double click on this last of the transform effects. And this time, instead of making the scale of the shape smaller, I'm going to make it bigger. I'm okay with a 15-degree rotation. But instead of making 4 copies, which is really resulting in too many lines here, I'm just going to do 2 copies. Again, this is cumulative, so these are being replicated all over the place here. I can preview it if I want to. I know this is right because I've done this before, so I'm just going to click on OK. Obviously, as you're experimenting, you'd want to preview to see what these effects look like. Welcome to Total Training for Adobe Photoshop CS. I'm Dick McClellan, the always gracious croupier here in our Creative Suite gaming parlor. And in this program, I'll be providing color commentary. No, really, I will, because all of these lessons are about color. Full, rich, glorious color. The stuff that Ted Turner wanted to add to every old movie, including the first and last 10 minutes of The Wizard of Oz. So whether you're rolling in green or betting it all on red, pull a chair up to the table and let the chips fall where they may. I've got 2 other images open that I'd like you to open. They're called Huge Fish Head 1 and Huge Fish Head 2.jpg. Technically, they're skulls, and I'm not sure this qualifies as a fish or not, but I'm not a botanist. What do I know? And I'm going to press Shift-Tab to hide those palettes on the right-hand side there. And these are 2 separate photographs that were photographed independently of each other using an Olympus E20N digital camera. And on the left-hand side, we have this prehistoric skull photographed with no flash. And on the right-hand side, we have the same skull photographed with a flash. Now, this is one possible scenario where you'd like to match the color of one image to another image. Another scenario would be if you have a series of images that are all going to be printed inside of, let's say, a catalog, and you want these images that were photographed under different circumstances to match each other in terms of color balance and so on. So now let's say our problem here is that I like the brightness values inside the flash skull. I like the fact we can see inside the fish's mouth, for example, and behind its head. So the flash is filling in some of these details. I like that, but I don't like how blue it is. I like sort of the orange, warmish colors inside the non-flash skull better. So how would I make sure to match this skull to that skull in terms of color? So keep the brightness values and the basic detail and structure of the right-hand image, get the color of the left-hand image. Well, first of all, make sure to click inside Huge Fish Head 2.jpg so that it's active. You want to make sure the second fish head is active. Then go up to the image menu, choose adjustments, and then choose this new command inside Photoshop CS, which is called Match Color. And that brings up this big old dialog box right here. I'm going to drag it over to the right-hand side just a little bit so that we can see what we're trying to match. Now, currently, it's telling me that the target for my edit is going to be Huge Fish Head 2.jpg, which is exactly what I want. And if you don't see it saying 2, you need to cancel out, make sure 2 is active, and then choose the Match Color command again, because this is the image we're going to change. Then we jump down. This is a pretty confusing dialog box, if you ask me, but we jump down to the bottom. And it's asking us, what's the source for our changes? And right now it's set to none, which isn't going to do us much good, right? I want to change that to Huge Fish Head 1. I can choose actually Brotherly Squish if I want to. I can choose any image that's currently open. So it doesn't have to match it in terms of size or content or anything. It can be any image on Earth as long as that image is open. However, you're going to get some pretty wild results if you just go with arbitrary images. I'm going to choose Huge Fish Head number 1. And it goes ahead and shows me a thumbnail for this image down in the bottom right-hand corner. So I can preview that image and make sure I have the right one selected. And if there's multiple layers, you can choose the layer that you want to use for your modification. So you can even edit inside of a document from one layer to another, match colors from one layer to another inside of a single image. Now I'm going to move this match color dialog box down a bit just for a moment so that we can see that Photoshop has already made a big change to my image. I'm going to turn off the preview checkbox so we can see what it looked like before. This is it before, this is it after. Oh my gosh, is that cool? It's cooler than the unflash photo. It's really the best of both of them. It has sort of this bronze quality. I just love this. Anyway, so this gives you a sense of the kind of colors it's bringing over into this image. And I'm going to drag this back up because you can make further edits using these image option slider bars right here. Luminance makes the colors lighter or darker. So if you want your colors to be brighter because you think they're too dark, you can increase the luminance. If you think they're too bright, you can decrease the luminance. I'm going to take it to somewhere in the 90s. This is fine. Just a little darker does it for me. You can also make the colors more intense, which is the same as saturation. Every place else inside of Photoshop, it's called saturation, except inside this dialog box. It's called intensity. That's fine. Means the same thing. So very intense colors or less intense colors. And notice when you drag down the intensity value, you're not so much making the colors gray as you're making them a uniform hue. So whatever Photoshop decides is the average hue of the source document becomes the hue that gets applied across the board when you go to a low color intensity value. I'm going to drag this back up someplace right about there. That's good. I'm just eyeballing it at this point. And then you also have a fade option. And fade is exactly the same as that fade command under the edit menu, except that you can do it directly inside the dialog box. And I'm just going to fade it a little bit. The weird thing is that inside the fade dialog box, the edit fade command, an opacity value of 100% means no fade at all. Whereas here, a fade value of 0% is no fade at all. So it's all upside down. So if you just want to fade it just a little bit, then you enter a very small fade value like so. And then the neutralize checkbox just tries to neutralize any perceived color cast. So if Photoshop perceives there's a color cast, you turn on neutralize and it'll get rid of whatever it thinks that color cast is. And apparently it thinks the big color cast might be this orange color that's coming from the other skull, the non-flash skull. In my case though, that's what I want. I want that orangish, so I'm gonna not neutralize the colors. And then I'm going to click OK to accept those changes. Now, let's say I'm not sure about this change. I'm thinking about changing my mind, but I don't want to get rid of this change that I've made. I want to save it and set it aside and think about it a little bit. I'm going to duplicate this image, the modified Huge Fish Head 2 image, by choosing Duplicate from the Image menu. And that'll bring up this dialog box that's asking what you want to name this duplicate image. And I'm just going to go ahead and call it Changed Head and click OK. And then I'm just going to set that aside, put it in back actually. Now I'm going to go back to Fish Head 2 and I'm going to press Control-Alt-Z or Command-Option-Z on the Mac. That back steps in order to restore the fish head as it appeared before I applied match color. Now I'm going to do something different. You can apply match color across entire images the way we just did. Or you can apply them according to just selected regions of an image. So I'm going to start by going over to Huge Fish Head 1, and I'm just going to select a portion of its background using the rectangular marquee tool. Doesn't matter what you select, as long as you just make sure to limit your selection to this sort of bluish grayish background area. And then I'm going to go back over to Huge Fish Head 2, and I'm going to select an area of that as well. Again, select inside this background region. So this time I'm saying, well, what would happen if I'm not so much interested in matching the orange of the fish skull, but I'm more interested in matching the sort of bluish gray of the background and getting rid of this really vivid blue of the background from the flash image. Okay, so I've made a selection inside both images. We can only see the selection inside the active image. That's just the way Photoshop works. But both selections are intact. Make sure Fish Head 2 is active. Now, let's say I want to revisit the last modifications I made inside the Match Color dialog box. If I just choose the Match Color command again, unlike variations, Match Color does not automatically track your last changes. So it'll just bring up the defaults, which we saw the first time, just 0, 0, 0 for everybody and no change made to the image and so on. If you want to revisit your last changes inside most color adjustment dialog boxes, basically everything except variations, You have to press and hold the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on the Mac and then choose the command once again while the Alt or Option key is down. And notice this time it brings up our last changes. Now notice what Photoshop is doing. It's just applying this match color change to the selection. That's it. It's just applying it to the selected region, and that's not what I want. So the very first thing I do is I say ignore selection when applying adjustment. I go ahead and turn that checkbox on. And that will go ahead and apply whatever adjustment it is that I'm trying to apply to the entire image. Now you have the option, when you come down here to Image Statistics, you have the option of 2 additional checkboxes. You can use the selection inside the source image to calculate colors, and you can use the selection inside the target to calculate colors. And we definitely want to do that. Otherwise, what was the point of making those selections in the first place? As soon as I turn on either one of these checkboxes, though, things are going to go crazy. Watch this. As soon as I turn on Use Selection in Source to calculate colors, oh my gosh, it changes my entire image to this horrible blue-gray. That's not what I want, right? So I think, hey, I'll turn that checkbox off. That was bad. Now I'll turn on the other checkbox. Watch what happens if I only use the selection inside the target image. Yikes. Nobody would do that to an image ever. I don't care what command you're using. It's terrible. Now you might think, well, both these checkboxes are bad then. No, they both need to be on. Really, if you're going to bother to make selections and you're going to try to match one selected area of an image to another selected area of a different image, you're generally going to want to have both of these checkboxes turned on. And at this point, I could fade the change if I wanted to. I could bring up the intensity a little bit if I wanted to. I could modify the luminance. We'll take it down just a little bit. And once you get something you like, click OK. And then if there's any doubt in your mind at this point, you still have your duplicated image to compare. So you can say, which one do I like better? Do I like this original guy over here where I didn't flash? Do I like my first change that I made without the selections, or do I like the second change I made with the selections? Pick one you like. I happen to like this one the best. But whichever one you like, go ahead and save that out. Close the other one without saving, or you can save it as a backup, whatever you want to do. This gets you a sense of the kind of things that you can accomplish using not only the match color command, but also the variations command to cure color casts and to match the basic color balance of 2 images to each other.
In this lesson, we're going to use 2 new features of InDesign CS that have been borrowed directly from Illustrator, and rightly so. The Compound Paths option and the ability to create new shapes using the Pathfinder palette are welcome additions to the software, and we're going to use them to create some unusual type frames and graphic objects. You'll see how these great new features will add to the layout designs we've made so far. Let's give them a whirl, shall we? Let's come down to the Layers palette for a second. Just open that. We can see 3 layers in here. So what we're going to do is come down to the New Layer icon at the bottom, hold down the Option key or the Alt key to create a new layer and bring up the dialog box at the same time. And we'll just call this one Circle Text. Go ahead and click OK. Now we can close the palette down. We know which layer we're working on. Let's close it up. And the first thing we want to do is find the exact center point of this page. We're going to draw 2 circular objects, one on top of the other, and use one to punch a hole out of the other one, making it completely transparent. And we're going to use that for a text object. So we need to create guides that form exactly in the center here. Now, obviously, our document is an easy enough size. It's 200 by 160 millimeters. So we know we could create a guide at 100 across and 80 millimeters down. However, if you remember the Create Guides option we used earlier on, we can use that instead. Come up to the Layout menu. Go down and choose the 3rd option, which is Create Guides, and make sure that the Preview button is turned on the right-hand side so we can see it as we go along. And we'll also set the options to go between the margins and not the page. Now, at the moment, we have neither rows nor columns. Let's click in the number here for the rows and click up to 1 and then to 2, and we can see a row of 5mm guides is placed through the middle here. Well, let's bring the gutter of that down to 0, and what InDesign will do is create 1 guide only, exactly down the middle of the page. Let's do the same for columns. Let's push that up to 2. Once again, there's a 5mm gap. Let's push that all the way down to 0 and click OK. We now have two guides in exactly the center of the page. Now we're ready to draw our shapes. So if we come back over to the tool palette on the left-hand side and go to the basic shape tools, which currently the polygon tool is selected. So let's click and hold on there and go back to the ellipse tool. And what we can do is somewhere in the top left, maybe even snap to the top left-hand guide. Let's hold down the Shift key, click and drag, and draw our first circle. Now, if we keep coming down towards the bottom, we can snap it into the bottom margin, but do make sure that Shift key is continually held down. And we can see our first object, a solid black circle. Double check in your control palette that the width and the height values are both set to 140 millimeters. As long as you have the same margins, guides, and page size as we have here, that shouldn't be a problem. Now, what we want to do is obviously make sure that this aligns now on the central guide. It's difficult to do because we can't see where that guide is. Well, temporarily, we could hit the Shift X key and swap the fill and the stroke around so we can now see the guides through the object because it doesn't have a fill. Let's pick up the center point here and drag it so it snaps into place, and then hit Shift X again to swap the colors back around, and we can see the measurements are all even. The X is 30 millimeters across, the Y is 80, and that's based on the left-hand anchor point for this object. That's what was last selected, but we can see the width and the height are still 140. What we want now is another circle, which is 50 millimeters squared. So very quickly, what we could do is hold down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and just click and drag a copy of this circle to a slightly different location. So we now have one on top of the other. Then quickly come up to the width and height options here in the control palette. Turn on the lock button next to them. So when we change one dimension, it changes both. And let's key in 50 and hit enter or return to apply that change. And obviously that's scaled down centrally and on the left-hand side according again to the anchor point. Now what we can do is position this absolutely anywhere inside the overall shape, but if we now select both of them, we can see one new option has appeared in the control palette. We just shift select this outer one again, have a look. The top right hand side is blank. If we shift select the outer shape again, all of a sudden we have 6 new icons in here. These are basically the align options all contained in the control palette. Now they're very straightforward. There's obviously align left, centered and right, and this is vertically, and this is horizontally, and align top, middle, or bottom vertically. Well, we want to do both, obviously, so we're going to hit the top center one, and we'll hit the bottom center one, and you'll see that the central shape here was moved across and down. The outer one didn't move at all. They are now perfectly aligned. Now, with that in mind, you might be wondering, where are the distribute options? Well, those still exist inside the align palette. If you go to the window menu, alphabetically, obviously, align is the first palette we can choose, and we can see that the distribute objects are still here under the original align objects. Now we're going to use those later, so don't worry, just to point them out that they do still exist. They're just not up here inside the control palette. Now that we have these two elements selected, we can very quickly make them a compound path. All we need to do is go up to the object menu, and we can see compound paths is almost at the bottom here, and there's just one simple option that says make. And you'll see the command for that is exactly the same as Illustrator, Command 8. Apply that and you'll see that the central circle has now been punched out of the outside one, making a transparent hole, so any picture or element that was in the background here would now show through. Well, like I said earlier, we're now going to turn this into a text frame. At the moment, it's set with nothing. It's just a graphic shape. However, if you remember earlier on, we went to the object menu as well, and we showed that if you went down to content, you could choose whether this is a text frame or a graphic frame or completely unassigned as it is now. So let's go ahead and turn it into a text frame, and we'll see the good old-fashioned 2 boxes, one on the top left, one on the bottom right, that specify that it is a type frame, and also this is where any overflow would be taken care of. And what we do want to do is quickly divide this up into a series of columns so we can put some type into it. So let's hit Command B. This is a command we haven't used before, but it is a window that we have used by going to the object menu. Command B or Control B on the PC will bring up the text frame options. And we can see that at the top there, we do have the number of columns and the gutter. So let's just pull this out of the way. The preview icon is turned on. So let's click and take the number of columns up to 5. And let's take the gutter down to about 3 millimeters. Let's say OK. Now let's say at this point on your TV screen, you're probably having difficulty seeing the column guides as opposed to the black background itself. Well, that's a very easy thing to change through the Layers palette. Come back down to the Layers palette for a second, open it up. We can see that Circle Text is the layer we're working on, and our selected object is obviously showing up highlighted here on the right-hand side. but you can see that the selection color is blue. Dark blue on a black background doesn't really work. So go ahead and double click on that to bring up the layer options, and you can see here there's a drop down menu which will give you various colors to choose from. Let's go and choose something much different. Let's go for yellow. Okay, highlight that and say OK. Now you can see the column guides a lot better because we see the yellow on the background. Obviously, once you click and deselect the shape, you will not see the border around the outside, but the column guides will always be visible. Again, if that gets in the way, you can hit the W key at any time to preview, and all you will see are the finished printed objects on the page. Let's bring the preview mode back. Now what we want to do is apply one more text frame option. That's why we really needed to change the color here so we could see it. So once again, select the same compound path object and hit Command B or Control B to bring up those text frame options. And we can see in the middle left-hand side here, we have an inset value. Now this specifies a kind of a bounding area around the edge of any shape that is a text frame and forces the type to run away from it. It's not the same as text wrap. Text wrap on an object like this would force other text in other text frames to be pushed away from the outside. The inset will force the type that's inside this text frame to move away from the edges, giving us a little bit more space around the side of the type. So it can be used on an object like this, or even something very simple such as a rectangular text frame. So let's take the inset value and just click it up a few times, and we can see a separate line appearing around the inside of the shape. Let's take that up to around 4 millimeters. Go ahead and click OK in the text frame options when you're done. We can see the lines are now all visible and all set ready to go. Once again, the W key will hide anything that is not selected. If you do deselect now, again, we see everything clean. W key to bring it all back. What we need to do now is quickly apply some type options into this so we can flow some type in. So let's select the type tool here. Make sure that we are clicked anywhere inside our first column to select it. And we'll come up to the character options. And we can see that Chronos Pro Light Italic is my latest selected font. That's exactly the one that I want to use. The type size at the moment is 7 point. We're going to reduce that down. Let's bring it to about 5 point, nice and small. Because the thing is, we're going to flow a lot of characters in here. If they're a little too big, it won't follow the shape very well. You do need quite small font sizes to flow very evenly into a distorted shape such as this. And let's take the leading down to maybe 6 point. Kind of goes beyond the rules I normally set of 2 or 3 points larger. But again, it's going to look a lot better if we make the type very small and compact. The final thing we want to do is change the color of the type before we flow it in. So let's come down to the color palette, open it up, make sure that we're on the text fill. We still have the stroke selected there from last time, and go ahead and just click the white swatch on the right hand side. Now our type is set up ready in the right font, the right color and everything. What we have to do is fill it with placeholder text. Use your keyboard shortcut for that, Shift Command F12 or Shift Control F12. And all of a sudden, that whole text object will be filled with beautifully organized type in exactly the right size. The only thing we might want to do to finalize that is, again, just click somewhere and say Select All, and let's hit Shift Command J or Shift Control J, which you remember is the keyboard shortcut, to justify the type. Now, justifying it will obviously adjust some of the line breaks, and we can see that there are some gaps appearing down the bottom right-hand side. So if you want, you could hit the Fill with Placeholder Text command again, and just close up that extra gap at the bottom. If we now keep the Apple key or the Control key held down and click outside of the shape, it will deselect it. Let's hit the W key to go into preview mode, and we can see the finished layout here. There are obviously things like line breaks, hyphenation, optical kerning, all of these things that you could apply, but the basic here is that we've created a complete text frame with multiple columns and a very interesting shape, by starting with 2 very simple geometric objects and making them into a compound path. Okay, let's hit the W key now to bring the preview options off. And if we use a new shortcut, which is the L key on its own, that will give us the ellipse tool, the one we used a second ago, but we just went to the tool palette to select it. So now we have that selected, we do know that these guides are perfectly centered, and we want to create another circle that sits in between these two, directly centered on those guides. Well, remember, if we hold down the Alt key or the Option key and the Shift as we draw and go directly from the center, any new shape that we draw will be perfectly centered on those 2 guides. Let's drag it out to an approximate size of maybe half of the area that we can see there, and then go up to the Control palette and make sure the anchor point setting is set to the middle, so that any changes we make here will not adjust the fact that we've centered everything already. And let's just double check that the width is set to 30 millimeters. If we say OK, the height will also change because we have the 2 objects locked together. Let's choose quickly a new color for this. Back down in the color palette, we can see again we're filled with black. So let's just go back to CMYK and maybe pick sort of a light blue, something like that, so it stands out. Now what we're going to do is use a function here called Pathfinder, and we're also going to combine that with something wonderful called Create Outlines, which anyone who uses Illustrator will know very well also. Let's hit the T key just to give us our type tool, and somewhere over here on the right-hand side in a clear area of the page, let's just click and drag to create a small text frame, and let's just type in the letter Q, a capital Q, Shift Q. Okay, let's highlight that small character. Let's just pull it over here so we can see the changes as we go along. And let's push the size up pretty big. Let's go maybe 48 point, just so it stands out in the center there. Now I want to make sure that we're using the right character for this and also the right typeface. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Bold Italic. It's almost down at the bottom of the list there. And I'm also going to pull up the Glyphs palette to give us that really nice looking Q that we used earlier on. So go down to the Type menu, bring up Glyphs. And all we need to do to find that very quickly, obviously we have the Q character selected. We just need to say, show us the alternates for the selection, and we can see all of the Qs there. And we can either use the short, stocky line that comes off the end, or the long one that sits over here. Let's go for the stylized long one. I do like that. Okay, close that down. If we now come back to the selection tool, this type frame is selected. There is a character inside of it. What we want to do is use this as a graphic element to punch a hole out of this one. This is not a compound path. This will require Pathfinder to do so. Compounds are very handy when two shapes such as this sit inside of each other and don't need to overlap at the edges. What we want to do basically though is take this Q character, position it somewhere in the middle here. Let's get our zoom tool and just magnify up on this. Okay, pull ourselves into position. We want to get that roughly in the center to start with, just so it looks like the center of the Q is roughly over the guidelines. And then we can get the scale tool and make sure that our anchor point is in the center, which to me looks round about there. Now this is why the scale tool comes in handy. Free transform would go from this point. Okay, let's start dragging with the shift key to scale this Q up in proportion to the point where the tail of the Q just overlaps the very edge of the frame here. Now if we were to use compound path at this point, once we turn this character into outlines, it would punch a hole through this section, but what would happen here is we'd end up with a solid line, and then this part of the Q would turn out blue. So it would be blue here, blue on the outside, transparent in here. When two objects overlap, this is where we use Pathfinder. So before we can use Pathfinder, we have to turn this type into outlines, and we can do it two very quick ways. We can go up to the type menu, and we see Create Outlines is there. Or much easier than that, go ahead to the shortcut, which is Shift-Command-O or Shift-Control-O on the PC. Apply that command, and you'll see that all of a sudden we have outline type. That also means, if you figured it out, you could hold down the direct selection tool and access the points that make up this shape and physically adjust them. It almost allows you to create your own typography. We're not going to do that. Let's just go back to the main selection tool to be on the safe side. But we will now hold down the Shift key and select both of these elements and bring up the Pathfinder palette. That's underneath the window menu. So come up there, and you'll see just below the Pages palette is Pathfinder. And that comes up with 5 simple options. And we can try each one at a time. If we click on the first one, it will join the two objects together to make one. So you see all the central area has disappeared, but the tail of the Q has been added to the outside of the circle. Very cool way to create a shape. Just undo that. We go to the second one. This is the one we're going to use. You see it does a beautiful punch hole straight through the object with the tail of the Q looking like it just bleeds out into this white area here. Really nice way to create a shape. Let's undo that. The next one will only leave where the two characters overlap, so it'll actually use the circle shape to chop off the edge of the Q. So again, another way to create your own custom characters, because you can design shapes to give you the form of a serif you might want to use, and then use it basically like a cookie cutter to remove that part of the path. Let's undo that. The next one will basically give you a full compound path, so it makes a transparent hole only where the two overlap. Again, let's undo that. And then the next one is basically the opposite of the one we're going to use, which will use the background shape to cut a hole through the foreground one. So we're only left with this small tail of the Q where they overlapped. Well, obviously, let's now back up, go back to the option we're going to use, which is front minus back. That's the name it would be given in Illustrator. Close the Pathfinder palette down. Let's fit in window, and we can see now that we've created a very nice type layout using two very simple functions, compound paths and the Pathfinder. Now that the layers and graphics are all in place, we're going to pull the entire interactive experience together with some simple actions. We've seen how actions can be added to the head of a page, but now we're going to explore how just the proximity of a cursor is all that's needed to activate a remote rollover. Let's have some fun. So let's begin this lesson by adding our interactivity to these rings at the bottom that will then control all the items that appear on the page up here. Now, if you select the rings image, we can see that obviously it is an entire image. So really we'd need every single one of these to be separate. Well, in this case, because of the shape of the graphics, we physically can't do that. We could slice them up, but every slice is rectangular or square. So in some points, it's going to cut into part of another graphic. It doesn't make it very easy to define the edges between them. Well, this is where we bring in the function of image maps. It means we can draw specific areas which will react to rollovers on an image that is one entire piece. Now, to activate an image map, we can do that through the Inspector palette. Make sure that the rings image is selected here. Come up to the Inspector palette and hit the More tab at the top. You can see down in the middle there is a button that says Use Map. If we go ahead and turn that on, it gives itself a standard image map code name. That's totally fine. But if you have a look in the options bar across the top of the screen now, all the icons that were there before have disappeared. We now have access to the image map options. Now you see here that on the upper left-hand side, we have the Select Map Area tool. Then we have three very simple image map drawing tools, and we're going to select the third one, the Polygonal Map Area tool. This allows us to draw image maps to any shape that we want to. So if we come down here over the top of our image, this is the one that has the image map applied, and simply just click to create a point, and then keep clicking all the way around the outside of this ring to create an area that becomes an image map. We can see it's slightly transparent, so we can see through it to give us an idea of where we're going. Come around to the very top, and then when we're done, close it up, and we now have a completed image map. Now this will not show up when we preview, but obviously it's important to have it so we can see it when we're coding. Now we'll go back to the Select Image Map tool for now because we don't accidentally want to draw any more, but you'll see that the image maps are selectable, scalable, and movable. That's easy enough to change at any time. But now we have an image map, we're ready to start adding some actions to it. So once again, we're going to use the Rollover and Actions palette, which is available from underneath the window menu. Just come down here and choose Rollovers and Actions, and it will go directly to the Actions palette because there are no rollovers we can do on the image map itself. Now the action we're going to apply to this is not going to be done on a mouse click. The mouse click itself will take us from this point to the Italian page itself. So that's a straightforward URL link, which obviously we can use the Inspector palette for. However, every time we roll into this, we want it to activate this layer up here and also change the image on the right-hand side to reveal the Italian type description. So obviously our action is going to be on mouse enter. So make sure you select that in the Actions palette. And then what we can do is come across and click New Action here on the right-hand side. Once again, come to the Actions pop-out submenu here, go down to the Multimedia options, and then go down to where it says Show and Hide. Now this is a very cool action that allows you to show and hide individual layers inside your file. Okay, so you see the Show and Hide action is up here on the top right-hand side. The first thing it does is ask us which layer do we want to work with. Well, if we click and hold on that, we can see there is our Italia layer. And then it says what is the mode that we wish to apply when we roll into this particular command. Well, we have a choice of three. We can either hide the layer, show the layer, or toggle it. Toggle it will basically hide it if it's already showing, or show it if it's already hidden. Well, what we're going to do is have it hidden to start with, so we would choose to say show as and when we roll into this. Now this action has been created and applied, but there's a second one that we need to put in as well. Don't forget, our second slice over here on the right-hand side wants to have its image changed at exactly the same time. So whilst we're inside this particular command for mouse enter, let's go ahead and add another action to this. Make sure that is selected, then go to the Actions submenu again. This time go to Image, and then simply say Set Image URL, and that will allow us to change the image URL that's visible at this point. Now, one thing you'll notice is that occasionally GoLive does this thing where when you select a new action, it goes back and selects the first one again. So keep your eye on this and make sure that when you make changes to these, you are selecting the correct action as you do so. This does happen on both Mac and the PC. Now again, it's a very straightforward action to code. It simply asks you what is the image area that we wish to change. If we go and look at that, again, we can only see Home Changer. That's why we name all of these areas with IDs, so they get picked up by the actions. Once again, you can see I've just lost the connection, so go back and select it once more. And then finally, choose the link that we're going to go to. So we'll just point and shoot this, go across to our Images folder, and inside there, if we scroll down, we can see we have Home To, and we have Home to Italia. That's the one we want to change it to with our text in place. So I've selected that. It's now been coded in. What we can do is press Control S just to save all of the coding that's been done so far. Now, obviously, if you look back at the actions, we look at the Show and Hide option. It tells us that the Italian layer, when we roll into this, will become shown. Well, if we look at the layout as it is, the Italian layer is already visible. So why do we have an action to say show it when it's already there? Well, the intention is that this layer will not be visible when we launch the website. And for that, we need to put an action into the head section that tells this guy to disappear and only become visible when we roll over the image map. So making sure the head area is twirled down, come back over to the Smart Objects area of the Objects palette and come down once more and choose a head action from the lower left-hand side and drag that straight up into the head section. Once again, it says on load. Currently, there's no actions. So what we'll do is go back to actions. And instead of going all the way back down to multimedia, you can see that because Show and Hide was recently used, it's available up here at the top to simply access very quickly. Yet another new feature of GoLive CS. So Show and Hide is available at the top there. Once again, select the Italia layer. And this time where it says mode, set it to hide. So this means when the file loads, Italia becomes hidden and will stay hidden until the user rolls into that particular image map at the bottom of the screen. That is now all set up and ready to go. Let's just save that. And then let's do a very quick preview to launch this in our browser. We can see the file comes up. Let's just expand the window here so we can see our navigation at the bottom. And you'll see that the Italia layer is completely hidden right now, as is this background image. This is still the same continual image. However, if you now roll over that central ring, two things appear. Our column of type appears on the right-hand side, and our Italia thought bubble appears on the left-hand side. Now, it's extremely cool, but there's something else we need to add to this. If you roll out of the area, have a look what happens. Everything stays where it is. Well, obviously, the action is telling the things to change. We need another action that says when we roll out, change them back to where they were. So obviously, when we roll out of it, it'll go back to being blank. Then when we roll into each of these, we can set it to show different country information. So what I'll do is I'll just exit Internet Explorer, come back into GoLive. Make sure that our image map is selected here at the bottom of the page. You can always scroll down a bit just to make sure that's highlighted. And we can see that on mouse enter, we have the show, hide, and set image URL actions. What we can do in GoLive CS now is select both of those. So make sure you have one selected, hold down the Shift key and select the next one. And then simply press Control C or Command C to copy those actions into memory. This is very handy because now we can go to the mouse exit option, click inside the actions area, and then press Control V or Command V on the Mac to paste those exact two actions already preloaded with all the options that we need into the second mouse function. So mouse enter stays as it is, but let's come to mouse exit, select show and hide, and make sure that Italia show is now changed to hide, because obviously we need to set it back to where it was. And the same for set image URL. It currently says home changer. What we need to do is point that back to its original image. So point and shoot back over here to the images folder and then set it back down to home02.jpg. This will reset it to the original image. What we can do now is again save that, preview it inside our browser. And then if we come down and roll into our area, code is still there from what we just had. If you roll out now, you see everything resets. We have this wonderful interactivity simply being activated by rolling into an image area. This is a really cool way to work.
The first series ever produced by Total Training was called Total AE, way back in 1997, when Adobe After Effects was barely a teenager in software terms. And throughout the years, we've continued alongside Adobe to revamp, update, and expand our product to its current state, the longest, most comprehensive series we offer on one of the most powerful visual effects programs on the planet. I know I'm biased, but after more than a decade of teaching people, I absolutely believe there is no better way to learn After Effects than with Total Training. Click on the After Effects button below to go to a sample lesson showcasing one of After Effects' newest and most exciting features, the completely new Type Engine. Even if you have no experience in After Effects, I suggest you take a look. It's very impressive. Also included in this dynamic media section is a selection from our series on Adobe Premiere Pro. When Adobe decided to rebuild Premiere from the ground up, we at Total Training followed suit with this terrific series. Over the course of 6 DVDs, digital filmmaker Jacob Rosenberg takes you through the ins and outs of this impressive new editing software. Add Adobe Encore DVD and Adobe Audition to the mix, and Total Training has a solution for the entire Adobe video collection. Choose a topic and enjoy. Okay, enough with the layout already. Let's get things moving. And when it comes to animating text in After Effects, prepare yourself to adopt a whole new way of doing things.
So we're just going to create some text to work with here. Let's start with something simple. I'm just going to grab our text tool. I'm going to add a simple phrase here with the default settings in our text palette. Some nice public service message here. I'll select all and use some of the keyboard shortcuts to actually increase the size of our type so that it occupies a nice chunk of the center of our composition. And I'm also going to go to the family settings here in our Helvetica family and choose something like black condensed, which will give us a nice thick rectangular font. I'm going to scrub our size a little bit bigger here. Boy, Photoshop should borrow this feature back from After Effects because this is a really great feature. And this will be our starting point. Let me hit the Enter key on the keypad. And when the time finally comes to animate your text, the first place you may look when you first open After Effects 6 and start playing with text is the character palette for a place to set some keyframes like you would set maybe in the effects palette. But there are no stopwatches in this palette. There's no way, in fact, to set a keyframe here in this palette. Same thing with the paragraph palette. And if we go down to the timeline and check out the properties for our text layer, twirl it open, and twirl open the transform properties, well, there we go. We have all of the transform properties that we have for other layers, but guess what? They do exactly the same thing to the entire layer that all of the other transform properties do in After Effects. Scaling, for example, just scales the entire layer. It doesn't scale individual characters, and adjusting the position, same thing, just moves the whole layer around on screen as if this was a solid graphic that we brought in from another application. So what's the deal? How do we actually animate individual characters or the properties that we set up in the character palette? Well, it turns out the way this is set up is a direct result of the fact that the type engine inside most computers was optimized years ago for print. So a lot of the settings that you can adjust in the character palette and the paragraph palette are not designed in any way to animate. In particular, things like point sizes, which may seem like an obvious thing to animate. You want to scale up a font, right? Well, a font can look quite different at a small point size, like 10 points, than it does at a really large point size, like, say, 78 points, like we have right here. The actual outline that defines that font is actually stored within the font software to represent a different shape that looks better at a small size than the shapes that look bigger when you're using the same font for headlines. Same thing with the kerning. The actual kerning values, etc., may be different for very small point sizes as opposed to large point sizes. So what we have here is a way of setting up our initial state of our type, the initial look of things on screen, the actual artistic layout of how our type looks on screen. But all of this is intended to be just a starting point. To animate this stuff, we have to actually do a little more work. In fact, we have to add something called an animator to this layer. Now you can do that up here in the animation palette. If we pull down the animation palette, you can see there are 2 properties here that relate to text. Animate text, which allows us to choose a property that we want to animate. And then this next selection, add text selector for range or wiggly. We'll talk more about what these things mean in just a second. But I don't really find myself going up here to the animation palette too much. I much prefer just twirling open the layer in the timeline where we're going to be working on it anyway, where I can discover next to the text property here
this little pop-out called Animate, where I now have access to all of those same properties that we just looked at. For example, if we wanted to now animate the scale of our individual letters, I would pop open this pop-up and choose Scale from the list that's presented to me. When I choose that, a whole bunch of new options are added to my timeline. Now, a quick look reveals that the text property that was there before has been twirled open, revealing a couple of options that were already there: source text, which you can actually change over time, and path options, which allows us to do text on a path. We'll talk about that in just a second. But this next grouping was just added by choosing the Animate pop-up. An animator was added to our text. This is a special custom animation group that we just added. In addition to that, a range selector was added. Now, we had all of our text selected because the entire text layer was selected, so by default the range that's selected is all the type, and all of our type will now be affected by this scale property that was added. This scale, unlike the point size up in the character palette, can be animated. So at 100% default value, we're looking at 78 point text because that's what we set in our character palette. And starting with that 78 points, we can take that down to 50%, which would give us essentially 39 point type up here. But you'll notice that the spacing of the letters stays consistent, so that animating the scale of the type is a nice way to actually make it sort of grow on screen. Well, that's kind of cool. So let's set up a simple animation. Let me jump out to around 1 second and reset my scale value. That'll give us a nice 100% scale value. Set a keyframe, jump back home, and set this value down to 0 because it's linked. Both of those values will set to 0. And as a result, we should, if I hit the space bar, get a nice animation of our I Hate Beats slogan growing from 0 to 100%, and then just sitting there. Looks very nice. All right? So that's how you animate a text property in After Effects. But of course, it gets more complicated than this. We've now set text as a property we want to work with. What if now we want to set, say, rotation, so that the letters not only grow, but spin as they grow up? Well, now that you've learned we go to the animation pop-up, you might be tempted to go back to the animation pop-up again and choose rotation. And you know what? In some cases, that might be the right thing to do. And as you learn how all this works, there are times you're going to be adding extra animators. But if you look at what happened in the timeline, I have now added a separate animator, a separate range selector, and we've added this rotation property down here in the timeline. And our timeline is starting to get fairly complicated. So let me undo that really quickly and show you that any one animator can have a wide variety of properties assigned to it. So for example, if instead of going to the Animate pop-up, we go to the Add pop-up, we will actually add properties to this current animator that we've already set up. Clicking on Add allows me to select from properties or add a different kind of selector. Now from the property pop-up, we choose rotation. We've now added our rotation property to the same animator and range selector that we had before, and that gives us the ability to control both of these properties with the same animator, and it also keeps things a little bit neater here in the timeline. So if over the case of the same 1 second, we also want to rotate things around 1 time, we can now scrub to the timeline and see that as things scale up, they also rotate up into place. Now you may have noticed that the point of rotation and the point of scale happens to be the baseline of our text. That's kind of the default behavior of After Effects. In fact, if we look closely at our type layer here, you'll see that the anchor point for our type layer, as we typed it in, is set in the lower left-hand corner of our type layer. This represents both the baseline and gives us a quick visual cue that the type that we're working on is flush left. If, for example, I zoom out a click and perhaps refine our public service message a little bit by adding another line of text, and this time I center the text by hitting Shift-Command-C before I start to type, when I now hit return, you'll notice that the anchor point for this layer, as I zoom in a click, is very clearly still at the baseline, but it's now in the center of this layer instead of the lower left. So we got a quick visual cue there of how the type is actually justified, left, centered, or right. But it's also giving us a visual cue that any sorts of animation manipulation that we're going to do is going to basically be centered around the baseline of the text. Well, how do we change that? Let's go back to our I Hate Beats layer, since that's the most important message that we need to convey here in our public service announcement. In fact, I think I'll even delete the other text layer that we were working on there for just a sec. Reselect our layer here. Now let's talk about how we can adjust that. For example, you might go down to your transform settings and try adjusting the anchor point there. And if you click it and drag it, sure enough, on screen, the anchor point of the layer is obviously changing. But if we go back and we scrub our values, you'll see we're still rotating around the baseline. That's not changing the rotation point of the type as we scrub. So let me undo that. Don't want to change that anchor point. So just really forget about the transform properties. Even though we don't need to animate the anchor point, in order to adjust the anchor point for other animators, we need to use the anchor point that's available here in Animator 1. So if we choose anchor point from this pop-up, you'll see it gets added to our list. We don't need to keyframe this. We just want to adjust it. If we adjust that down so that the anchor point is now centered on the letter, and we scrub, you'll see that our rotation and our scale now happens perfectly around the center of our letters. Now you can actually use this for some really nice stylistic stuff. If, for example, we really take our anchor point out into the boonies somewhere and then scrub, you'll see we get these nice zippy swoopy type animations. Let me select this property and set it back to 0 again to see that we've got ourselves a nice centered, scaling, rotating animation. Now, most of these other animator properties in here are pretty obvious. Things like anchor point, position, scale, skew, rotation, opacity, or the option to add all transform properties in one fell swoop if you know you're going to be animating all of them, or you just want the option to be able to do that. Well, all of these properties pretty much mirror things that we've already seen elsewhere inside After Effects. You can also animate the color of the fill, the color of the stroke, and the width of the stroke on the type if you would like to. All those things can be controlled. Tracking is another thing that you can animate. Let me add tracking. And in addition to that, let me add line anchor, because line anchor is sort of confusing. Sometimes you might be tempted to grab line anchor when you're trying to adjust the baseline shift of a series of type, which instinctively is what it sounds like. But it's not really about that. When you start adjusting line anchor, in fact, nothing will happen on screen. Nothing will happen on screen until you actually start adjusting the tracking amount. Notice that if we adjust the tracking amount, the letters spread out pretty evenly on screen. That's pretty cool. It's a cool thing to animate. But once you've adjusted the tracking amount above a certain value, you might also want to adjust where the tracking is sort of centered around, and that's where the line anchor comes into play. If you now start adjusting the line anchor to the right, the tracking value will grow out to the left. And if you adjust the line anchor to the left, the tracking amount will adjust itself off to the right. So basically, the line anchor allows you to control where the line is centered. You can actually animate where the line is centered. Obviously, 50% is centered directly on the line so that you get a nice grow out from center.
We have our still image sequences and our Photoshop sequence to connect them, but our images remain static. The image pan filter from former versions of Premiere is gone, but it's been replaced with something much better. We now have the ability to keyframe the motion values of any still or clip without applying any filters at all. It all happens in the easy and intuitive effects control window. Welcome to the world of motion. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start this lesson off by opening up 02 Italy Montage. You'll notice that as the project opens, you'll see each active sequence down below in the timeline window refresh into the window, as well as the sequences in the program monitor. Just to reveal something else, now that we finally have a lot more sequences in the program monitor over here, you can scroll between all your sequence choices by clicking and dragging this navigator bar here. And if I go ahead and click on Portofino Stills, that will make it active down below in the timeline. So let's go back to our project window and let's go create a new sequence. Let's go ahead and click on New Sequence. And we're just going to call this sequence our Motion Sequence. The motion sequence can have 1 or 2 tracks. All of these settings are fine. I'm going to leave them as they are, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. The reason I'm creating a new sequence is because what I want to do is create some initial motion settings. I'm going to place some still images in this sequence, and I'm going to zoom over those images. Now, instead of going into every single still image and creating its own custom zoom or pan, I'm going to create 5 sort of global motion settings. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste those settings onto specific clips that I think will benefit from that sort of image pan. So what this means for those of you at home is if you create a certain filter or effect look that you want, you can copy and paste that effect into a backup sequence and then reference it by copy and pasting those attributes to other clips in other sequences. The point here now with this project and what we're exploring is the fact that I can have a number of different iterations of the edit that I'm working on. So with the motion sequence down in the timeline, let's double click on the Rome folder, and I want you to drag the following images down into the timeline. So because we have landscape pictures and portrait pictures, I'm going to take 3 landscapes and 2 portraits. So let's bring down Rome 13. We'll grab Rome 13, drag that down to the first position of the timeline. Let's go grab Rome 3. These are our 2 vertical shots. Okay, then we'll go ahead and grab Rome 10. Then the next shot we're going to bring in is Rome 01. And the next shot we're going to bring down is Rome 06. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press the plus key on my keyboard to expand the timeline. And let's go scrub down and look at these images. I'm going to slide my timeline up a little bit here so you can see it a little bit better in the window. Expand this track a little bit. So let's talk about image pans. Formerly, in older versions of Premiere, you would have the image pan effect. And this was an effect that you could apply to a clip like this, and it would zoom from one area of the still to another. The problem with the image pan and the big problem with former versions of Premiere is that they didn't respect the proper frame size of the image that you were panning. So you were always compromising the resolution of your image because you were either zooming in too far to the pixels and thus blurring your image and so forth. You can bring in a 2000 by 2000 document with 500 or 600 DPI and still get all of the resolution out of that image that you would expect in any other application that deals with imaging, such as After Effects and so forth. Now, for more sophisticated keyframe control, I would suggest you using After Effects. So let's go down into the timeline and let's reveal our effects control window. And what we've learned thus far is that when you select a clip in the timeline, its intrinsic effect values are visible immediately inside of the effects control window. If I add a filter to this clip, it will be listed below the fixed effects down here. But right now, I want to twirl down motion and sort of walk everyone through our basic motion parameters. Now, because we have pin to clip selected, we see that the boundary that we can scrub in this image is going to properly respect the clip boundaries of the instance down in the timeline here. Take a look at the timeline as I scrub through the clip up here. And if I select the second clip, that automatically updates with the timecode information of the second clip, and I can scrub through that clip accordingly the same way. So now I'm going to reselect our first clip, and then I'm going to talk again about these effects properties. What was cool there is that you notice when I clicked back on my first still in the timeline, it remembered or preserved the fact that motion was already twirled down for that clip. So let's look at these properties. The first thing to point out is that, again, in order to see this image update, I need to be clicked and selecting within the boundary of the clip. So the CTI is going to need to be within this section to actually add or adjust any keyframes. So now that we're inside of this clip boundary, let's talk about some of the different settings that you can adjust. If I click on motion, I get what's called direct manipulation of the image. You'll notice that the difference between clicking on motion and clicking off is the difference between the resolution slightly decreasing in the clip on the right, and I get this little handle for the center point of the image. So now I can drag the image and click in this square and move it around to control its position. Let me go ahead and make this monitor look a little bit better for what we're doing here. I'm going to go right-click on the wing menu, and I'm going to go down and choose Single View. Now, once my monitor is in single view, I'm just going to reduce its size. Okay, so we can see both the effects control window and this window at the same time. Let me go ahead and move this over here. I'm going to drag the interior edge of my effects control window to just update that so I have a little bit more real estate on that side. And then we'll pull this a little bit more to the left this way. Okay, so we're going to modify our effects controls here, and our program monitor is going to preview those modifications for us as we make our adjustments. So let's now go over the independent parameters of adjusting motion in your effects control window. Okay, with direct manipulation turned on, meaning motion is active, again, any adjustment that I make is going to modify what the value settings are in my dialog to the left. You notice I'm only affecting the position. I can't affect scale at this view. That's because I can't see the handles on the outside of my still image. I need to reduce the view to see some of those handles. I can go back out 25% or to 10%. So for this training, I need to get out pretty far on my monitor. But for those of you at home, if you have a dual monitor, you can make your monitor resolution nice and big, and you can play along with me at home to have a little bit more accuracy. If I grab in the center point, I'm going to be modifying the position. If I grab any of the 8 control handles on the outside of the image, I'll be adjusting its scale. Now, I have the ability to toggle off the uniform scale adjustment. So if I was to turn off uniform scale, I could pull in from the left side, and I would actually be pinching the image. Let me undo that, change that back to 100%, and let's say I pull from the top right or left handle. Now as I'm adjusting, I can drag it inwards to reduce the size, but because I don't have uniform scale turned on, I might be distorting my image in a way that I don't really want. To change this or correct this, I need to hold down the Shift key and then make the adjustment. With uniform scale turned off, holding down the Shift key overrides that setting and preserves the original aspect ratio of your clip or still. And remember, these adjustments aren't just possible on still image, they're also possible on full motion video clips as well. Again, just revealing some of the direct manipulation controls, I could just change the size of this image to shrink it down to be something much smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reset the value for this clip. That's going to snap it back to its original size and position. With uniform scale checked, I'm just going to click in this scale box over here and just enter 30 to shrink this down so that it's centered within our visible area. So the next thing I'm going to do is try to articulate the difference between changing the position and changing the anchor point for your motion effect. Imagine, if you will, that this center point in the middle of the clip is a pin. So it's a little tack that's sticking through my image. My image is this image here. Right now, that pin is stuck literally at the center of the visible area. If you take a look at the position represented by the numbers, it reveals 360 by 240. Now what Premiere does is it assumes that the top upper left corner is 0, 0, and the bottom right corner is 720 by 480. So if I select the position 0, 0, you'll see that the center of our image snaps up to that position. The reason the center of our image snapped to that position is because the anchor point that we have assigned in this area here, thinking of it as our stick pin, is what it uses to move that position up to that quadrant. Currently, our stick pin is in the dead center of our image. We see that information reflected by the 360 by 240 value. If we wanted to move our image based on the bottom right-hand corner of the image, we would need to change this value to 720 by 480, thus reflecting the bottom right corner of our image. Now, if I grab the image, I'm pulling it and moving it based on its new anchor point in the bottom right corner. Now, as I move this around, you'll see that the numbers representing the position change, while the anchor point value is not changing at all. That's because the anchor point has been firmly assigned on top of that clip. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to reset this value again, center it back there, enter the scale back to 30. And now the reason why I'm showing you all this information with anchor points is because it relates directly to scaling and rotating your images. Because this is the point that we've assigned to sort of stick an anchor on in our image, if I rotate the image a certain number of degrees, it rotates based on that center anchor point. If I was to offset the anchor point down to the bottom right-hand corner down here, let's enter that, 720 by 480. Now, when I rotate the image, it rotates based on that anchor point. This is important because you need to set up your anchor point before you animate your image. Because if you perform a scaling or rotating operation on a clip and then change your anchor point after the fact, you'll get a much different, probably unexpected result. So now that we understand some of the basics about affecting all these parameters, let's go ahead and reset this clip, start from scratch, and take a look at working with keyframes in Adobe Premiere Pro. So for this first clip, what I need to do is I need to turn on keyframing to animate this effect or animate some sort of a motion pan. Again, all the direct manipulation adjustments we've made would be for setting or assigning a static effect. So if you have no keyframe toggled turned on, you're just going to be setting your overall motion effects in this window. The second you turn on the keyframes, you enable yourself to animate that value. The first thing I want to do is I want to adjust the anchor point. So I want this image to start zoomed in on me and Paula and then zoom out. But I want the zoom to originate from the center point between me and her. I'm going to go over here and slide my anchor point up a little bit. And by sliding it up, I'm going to move the image down in relation to where the anchor point is. I know it's a difficult concept, but the more you play with it, and by the end of this little sequence that we're going to adjust, you should have a pretty good idea as to what the difference between adjusting your anchor point and adjusting your position is. Now that I've picked the anchor point that I want to be for my image, I'm not going to set that to be a keyframe adjustable setting. I'm only going to turn on scaling and position as keyframe values to be adjusted. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually just first going to make my adjustment to the image. I'm going to pull from the left corner. I actually want to pull to the left to zoom in. And because I have uniform scale turned on, it's just going to scale my image accordingly. Okay, so I zoomed in to this point on the image here. And then from here, I can go ahead and modify my position. Now I can drag the position down to change so our faces start in the middle. Once I've picked my first point where I want the image to start to pan from, I go ahead and click on the position stopwatch and the scale stopwatch. That sets keyframes. These are specific values for the first frame of our still image that's selected down below in the timeline. While opacity has one keyframe to reflect its one opacity value, motion has a number of independent keyframeable properties. These are known as your transform controls. So what I want to do is I've picked my point of origin. I've picked where I want my still to begin at, and then I'm going to go ahead and scrub to the end of the still image back over here on the right. Now, once I've moved the CTI to the end of the clip, all I need to do is adjust the value of the scale, position, and so forth. So now let's zoom out on the image. We'll just scrub left inside of scale, and we're dynamically reducing the size of the image. Once we pick how much information we want to be available in the image, we can stop scaling. Okay, so this scale is fine. Now all I need to do is adjust the position. Because I have motion selected, I can go click and drag this to be exactly in the space that I want. So if I move this to here, that's fine. Again, I can just scale back out. Let's just drag that out. And that's probably fine. I'm just going to click and pull it down. If you do not see your direct manipulation wireframe here, motion is probably not selected. It's the difference between this, if I click off of that, and this. Okay, so you want to make sure you're clicking on it. Now, what just happened, because I modified the position and scale of the image, 2 keyframes were added because they differed from the original keyframes that were set for the image. If I scrub back, if you watch the scale and position values, they will change dynamically as I work my way back to the point of origin in the clip. If I press the space bar, you'll see the wireframe will go away and we'll be previewing what motion effect we've applied. From that point, I can adjust and refine to my heart's content.
Okay, so you've got your mix and you want to put it on CD or DVD, but something's not right. It's too quiet, or maybe it sounds a bit boomy, or maybe you have multiple mixdown files, all mixed at different times, maybe on different computers with different speakers, and they're all at different levels. How do we remedy these problems and make it sound like a professionally produced CD or DVD? The answer is mastering, which these days is a topic of some confusion. What mastering was in the past and what it is today are essentially the same thing, with one critical difference: digital versus analog. In mastering's past, the job of the engineer essentially involved careful channel and EQ balancing, with maybe some limiting if needed. These criteria were optimized for the delivery format of the time: vinyl. Now, an LP had definite sonic limitations, primarily in dynamic range, and some other really wacky challenges that we just don't think about today. Like you couldn't use really low frequencies, or the stylus might skip, or that you actually had to account for a change in frequency as you approached the inner grooves. Today, however, mastering is about taking advantage of all that the CD format has to offer, particularly regarding dynamic range. This typically involves equalization and sweetening, gain maximizing, some occasional stereo width processing, and then some hard limiting. It's the latter that most people are familiar with, as this is the final step that allows you to make your files loud and in your face, truly pushing the limits of CD's 96 decibel dynamic range, if that's what you're going for. Now, if you don't know what any of this means, don't worry. It's what we're going to cover in this lesson. So put on your golden ears, it's time to master. One of the first things we'll typically do during mastering is filtering or equalization. We have lots of different filters to use inside Audition. So let's go up to the Effects menu, choose Filters, and you'll see that we've got roughly 8 choices here. Now let's talk about the parametric equalizer. So we're going to go into the parametric EQ, and this is typically the mastering engineer's friend because it offers you so much control. Primarily because you have 5 parametric bands, a lot of flexibility. You also have high and low shelving filters, so really you have 7 bands that you're working with here. Now a typical mastering scenario might be to cut some of the low mids, boost some of the high mids, and boost some of the highs. So why don't we do something just like that? So we can enable one of our bands here. We can select a frequency. Muddiness typically occurs in the 175 to 350 hertz range. So why don't we go right around, say, 260 hertz? And then we have our Q. Now this is again our bandwidth, how wide of a range we're going to affect when we boost or cut. And if we just look by taking the booster cut slider here, we can see that this is reasonably wide. Again, larger Q values mean smaller bandwidth. So if we selected, for instance, 8, much more narrow. I'm going to drop this back to about 0. And listen to what happens when I booster cut that frequency. You can hear that mud is sort of being accentuated. If we pull it down, it starts to sound a bit more clean. Okay, next thing we want to do is perhaps boost a little bit of the upper mids. Well, things like voices and guitars and even keyboards tend to resonate in the 2 kilohertz to 5 kilohertz range. So if we enable this band here, and let's use about 4K, which would be 4,000 hertz, also a very popular frequency used in 60s record equalization. So if you listen to a lot of Beatles records, particularly Rubber Soul, you might hear that there's a large boost at 4K, but that's sort of a nice, pleasing boost. All right, minus 12 is sort of too much, so let's bring this around minus 7. Let's play back. And listen what happens as I boost 4K. A lot of clarity, but a little too much. So maybe right around 3.3. You can, of course, bypass these changes. So here it is bypassed. Kind of muddy. And if we bring the EQ back in, just a little bit brighter, a little bit cleaner. Typically also I'll add a little shimmer at around 14,000 hertz. Shimmer for things like cymbals, but also for just attacks and string noise, and you hear the guitars kind of doing that wah-wah chonk thing. So shimmer can be brought out at around 14,000 hertz, and maybe we're just going to cut a bit of the extreme lows around 40 hertz. So I'm just going to preview this and listen to what happens. Just cut a little bit of those lows. Now I might want to add a little boost in the actual mid-range, maybe around 1800 hertz. I'm going to use a much smaller Q, or at least a little bit smaller, around 4.5. Here, that's that real mid-range kind of telephone kind of sound. If we pull it out, just give it a little bit. Maybe we'll move this up a bit more. Bypass it. Bring the EQ back in. Okay, so if we're satisfied with this EQ, and again, these are just very random sort of selections here, and I don't recommend that you typically cut things 7 dB or boost them 5.9 decibels. These are just ideas, so these aren't steadfast rules, but these are things that you can use. If you like what you've done, I will typically create a preset. Click on the Add button and call it My Preferred EQ. Click OK, and it shows up in the preset menu. Clicking OK will then process the file with that equalization. We've now begun the first step in mastering our file. The next thing we'll typically do is add some type of compression or limiting. Compression can be found under our Effects menu, in the Amplitude section, under Dynamics Processing. That will bring up the Dynamic Range Processing window, which is essentially our compressor, limiter, and expander. Now again, lots of different fields here in this traditional tab, and you can see that there are 4 tabs that you can work in. The traditional would be most familiar to musicians and engineers, where you basically set ratios and thresholds. And the Attack Release tab is for things like your gain processor, where you set your attack times and release times. Let's talk a bit more about the presets as well. We've got lots of different presets to choose from, so why don't we preview? Let's start with one of these at the top here and click preview, and I'll kind of let you listen to what some of these sound like. So we bypass it, bring it back in. And here it gets a little louder, a little fuller. Now if we try something like a classic soft knee, which emulates DBX style compression, listen to what that sounds like, and let's start with it bypassed. Let's bring the bypass out. Kind of pumps a bit more. So that's classic soft knee. Let's bypass it again. Back in. That may be a little aggressive, so maybe we should choose that first one, which just gave it a little punch, and click OK. So now again, we've added some compression. If you want to go back to the compressor or you want to undo a change that you made, you can of course Control Z or go up to the Edit menu and choose Undo Dynamics Processing. If you hit F2, that will take you back to the compressor window, and now you can make changes. Now, let's point out one thing here. If you're trying to compress the attacks, right, you're trying to compress the attacks and then sort of fatten them or thicken them up, and you're using this for a mastering process, this is the final process of compression, you typically don't want to use a ratio of more than, say, 2 or 3 to 1. The threshold that you set will essentially be determined by how loud your file is going in. If you set an extremely low threshold, it's going to essentially always be compressing, and that'll really flatten out your dynamics. So try not to set this too aggressively. -20 for a reasonably loud file might be a bit high, so I might use it around -18. If we go over to the Attack Release tab, you've got your attack and release times here. Why don't we use this in joint channel configurations? For most things, an attack time of 24 is usually okay. It might be a little fast for a final mix. So I typically would say that for mastering a final mix, attacks between sometimes 24, but as high as maybe 39 are generally preferable. So why don't we set this to around 31? And then the release time, again, for mastering a total track, well, 100 is okay. The faster the release, the less chance you have for pumping. The longer the release, the extreme length of a release time, for instance, say 500 milliseconds, you're just going to be compressing all the time. So you're really, again, going to flatten out the signal. So I'll typically use anywhere between 50 and 125 for release. For now, we'll leave it at 100 and click OK. Okay, so now we've compressed, we've added some equalization, and maybe we want to add some stereo expansion. Well, again, we can go up to Effects, Amplitude, and choose Pan Expand. Now, this is something that you find on a lot of pop records. I typically don't use this, but it's just a way to basically expand the left and right channels by basically playing with the phase. And you can see again that we've got lots of different presets here to choose from, even one for mastering width. I'm not actually going to apply that now, because I want to talk to you about hard limiting, which is going to be the final stage in this particular mastering process. Effects, Amplitude, Hard Limiting. The hard limiter is probably the most commonly used effects process because this is what allows you to make your mixes loud and in your face. And it's really very simple the way it works. You have what's known as a ceiling, the digital limits. The loudest you can go in the digital domain is 0 dB, 0 dB, 0 decibels, full scale. So you want to set this ceiling to just below that. Well, -0.1 is kind of hot, and sometimes if you burn CDs with a ceiling of that high, you might have some problems. I'll typically use around -0.3. You're not going to miss those 0.2 dB of dynamic range, believe me. Then you have your boost input. This allows you to essentially pump up your file, but again, no matter how much you boost it by, it will never exceed this limit. Anywhere between 4 and 10 dB is usually good, again, depending on the type of music that you're trying to boost. Classical music, well, you can usually use pretty high decibel amounts because it's very dynamic. The more you squeeze pop music, though, it might sound a little squashed and processed, and you may encounter some artifacts. Then you've got your look-ahead and release times. Your look-ahead is essentially a digital version of an attack time, and the release is the same as we just talked about. Now again, for a track like this, I might use a release around 75, but because we used 100 for the compression, I'm going to use 100 here. When we click on Gather Statistics now, this figures out how much we would have clipped if we didn't have this digital ceiling. We can preview the changes here. Put it in bypass. You notice in bypass, it's much quieter. Let's take the bypass out. Bypass again. No bypass. Click OK. And now just looking at the wave, it's nice and loud and fat. And as we can see here, it never exceeds a certain limit. And again, we can zoom in along the y-axis here, again, where we're showing decibels. Right-click and zoom. Right-click and zoom. Right-click and zoom. More detail. This is probably roughly minus 0.3 right about here. We can see that it never exceeds that limit right there. Pretty cool stuff. So again, right-click, zoom full. Now, I do want to emphasize, do I normally master my songs this way? Sometimes. Do you always want to give everything hard limiting and compression and parametric equalization and pan expansion? Probably not. But these are just some of the processes that you can use to make your music sound, well, for one thing, very modern, but also make it sound perfect when it goes to CD. Loud, in your face. Mastering processes. So one more time, these are processes that you'd probably use, for instance, if you were making a mixdown with content supplied with Audition, any of those loop files. Or basically, well-balanced, well-mixed, well-recorded pieces of material. Or even if they're not so well-recorded, just a way to sort of pump them up before you put them on your CD, throw it in the car, and impress your friends. If you have other types of mastering needs, real clinical sort of equalization, those can all be carried out also in the parametric equalizer, or with the graphic equalizer, or with our scientific EQs.
DVD menus are really the gateway to your video content, and they can also be a great place to get a little creative. Menus can be assembled in seconds directly inside of Encore, and if you like, customized further in Adobe Photoshop, or designed entirely in Photoshop and then imported as menus. However, the technical details surrounding menu creation can get a bit confusing, so hopefully this section will give you a clearer understanding of DVD menus in Encore. In this section, we'll be focusing on menus, how you create them, where they come from, how you manage them, and how they're built. To get started, I'm going to build some from scratch. In the library palette, you have all of the basic ingredients for assembling menus. Everything from entire backdrops, these two are solid black, to individual buttons, design elements, all these little pieces. And if I scroll through these, you can see the kind of things you can choose from. Some of these are just backdrops, the menu, and a submenu. So you have menu families built together, as well as the individual pieces. Well, when you first install Encore, by default, there aren't that many to choose from, surprisingly. And I thought it might be a good idea to let people know that there are extra ones on the installer disk, but you have to know where you find them and where to put them inside of Encore. If you go to the installer disk, in this case, it's the E drive. This is the installer DVD for Encore. Inside of the goodies folder is buttons, images, menu backgrounds, and templates. These are more library elements that we don't install by default to keep the application fairly small for download, but you probably want to add these to your library before you really start working in Encore. If we go into buttons, in the application folder for Encore, usually it'll be on your C drive in the program files in Adobe and Encore DVD, but that may vary depending on where you installed Encore. There is a library folder. And right now it contains the ones we just saw a second ago, but I want to add all of these to that folder. If I select all of them, drag them into the library palette, the system will copy them over. I'll do the same for images, menu backgrounds, and in this case we have to choose a file format. Since these are entire menu backdrops, it's going to ask me which video format I'm after, in this case NTSC. And do you want still backgrounds or video? I'm after the still backdrops right now. So if I select all of those, drag them into the library folder, you get the idea. Once each of these files has been dragged into the library palette, Encore will list all of the new ones. Well, now that we've installed those elements in the library folder, I need to tell Encore that the library folder has been updated. I'll switch back to Encore, and I need to relaunch it. So what I'll do is save my project, and I'll just save it on my desktop as project, and say save. I'll close Encore and relaunch it. This time when it launches, it's going to look in the library palette and realize that something has been changed. And in fact, it'll pause here for a second. Encore's building previews of all of those elements in the library folder. So if it takes a second to launch after you've installed other elements in the libraries folder, don't panic. It's just thinking. It doesn't tell you what it's doing, but it's building those previews. Once Encore is launched again, if I click on the library palette, you'll see the list is a little more robust. We have a few more items in here to choose from. This is more what I had in mind. And of course, if you click on these little thumbnails up here were what Encore was spending that time building. And you can click through these and see which ones you like. Okay, with that solved, I'll go back up to the top. I'll reopen my project. I'll just go to the File menu, and I'll come down here to Project and open that up. Now we're ready to start building menus with the complete list in the library palette. The easiest way to get started is to just look at the process of building a menu. As I mentioned, these are black backdrops in the library palette. You'll notice that in the list there are 2 items that have a pair of asterisks before them. These are default items. In other words, if I simply told Encore, build a menu, create a menu from scratch, it would choose this item right here, and I would get nothing but a black background. Sometimes that's what you want, sometimes that might not be what you want. You have the option of setting whichever element you want to be the default. If I wanted a 16 by 9, for example, to be the default, I can choose that preset in the library palette, right-click, and say Set as Default Menu. Now the asterisks will appear in front of that item. I'll go back to 4 by 3 because this is the one I really want to be the default. And at the bottom of the library palette are various buttons. You can filter the list much the same way you can in the project window. You can say, only show me menus, only show me buttons, and so on. There are also buttons to, in this case, create a new menu. Since this is the default, anytime I say create a menu, it'll use this one as the template. I'll choose that one and say new menu, and Encore gives me this black window here. And I'm going to scale this down so we can see it. And it's good to note that, of course, you can type a number in here. If I want 75%, for example, you can type that in. And even though it's not a preset in this list, it is a size that's available to you. In this case, I want 50% so that the whole thing fits. And I'm ready to start assembling the menu. Well, it's not very exciting, but it'll suit the purposes I have in mind. Right now, there's nothing in the menu at all. We have a black backdrop. And one of the main jobs of a menu is to have buttons or text elements that let you choose either chapter points or choose which language is going to be heard when you play a particular video track. Well, the first thing I need to do is add buttons to this menu. Much the same way you have a default menu, we also have a default button set here. If I were to simply say, create a new button, Encore would use this one by default. But if I want any particular button, I can certainly select one and drag it directly into the menu. I can also choose it in the list and click this button down here. It'll say place, it'll place it in the menu for you. I find it easier just to drag and drop it anywhere you want. Let me scoot this over so we can see it. We can drag from the list, or if you, for whatever reason, want to drag from here, you can also drag from the preview window, and it'll do the same thing. So to start assembling a menu, let me get rid of the ones I have here so far. I'll select each of these and just hit the delete key to get rid of them. I want this default button. I like this button, I just want to use it as a simple example. I'll go ahead and drag these into the window. I'll just drag 3 of these in here. Now, buttons in Encore are treated as objects. For example, in Photoshop, you can't select more than one layer at a time. I can't select one layer and then select this layer and select this layer. You can't select individual layers, much less layer sets. So I can select multiple buttons in the menu and treat them as if they were objects rather than layers. This means that I can, for example, if these were staggered, if I pull this one down here and this one was over here, I can select all of these, hit Control A to select all. And under the Object menu, I can choose to align their tops, for example, and raise them all to the same height. I can also distribute them horizontally, in other words, space them equally based on the 2 end pieces. It'll take this button and average any other buttons between them, between that space. So unlike Photoshop, I can treat layers as objects in here. And this comes with other advantages too. I can take an entire row of buttons, hold down the Alt key, and make a copy of them. And now I have 6 instead of 3. A much faster way of replicating instead of dragging them one at a time from the layers palette. If you need a lot of buttons quickly, bring them in, distribute them, and just copy the entire row. Because of the way Encore handles buttons inside of the menu editor, it gives you some other flexibility as well. You can do some things in Encore that you wouldn't think to be able to do in Photoshop. You can't do in Photoshop. And again, it's based on the concept of treating these elements like objects instead of groups of layers. If I select all of these buttons and decide, I don't like the style of the button I'm using, I want to swap this out for something else. If I select them all and go back to the library palette, I can choose a different button entirely and say, I really like this button more than I like these guys. I can choose this one, and at the bottom of the library palette is what looks like a refresh icon from the browser, or a recycle icon. It's called the replace function, and what it does is replace whatever you have selected in the menu editor with the currently selected button in the library. So I can choose a new button, click on the replace icon, and it may take a second to do it, but Encore will replace all of the buttons in your project with whatever the new style of the button is. I'll just hit Control Z to undo that. And looking back at the layers palette, I realize I have my choice of angled box, angled box, angled box, angled box, and so on. Kind of hard to tell which angled box belongs to where I'm linking. In Photoshop, I would double-click on this name, and if I double-click on it now, nothing happens. Double-clicking on the name in Photoshop would allow you to rename the layer. In this case, I have to select the layer and go to the Properties palette, and you can change the name of that layer set. This is basically a button. You can rename the button inside of here and say Chapter 4. And in the Layers palette, sure enough, we've renamed the button Chapter 4. All right, well, we have the makings of a pretty decent menu, but the background, okay, the background's a little bland, I'll admit. So what if we wanted to add one of the backdrops from the library on top of what we have now, or more importantly, behind what we have now? If I go back to the library palette, another basic rule of the elements in here is everything that has to do with button functionality is a PSD file. Buttons themselves are PSD files, backdrops are PSD files. So if I want to bring in an individual element, for example, if I choose this blue flare background, for example, if I wanted to place this in the menu, I can, even though it says background and it's a PSD, I can create a menu based on this as a template, or I can add it to an existing one. The way I would do that is choose it in the list, and at the bottom of the library palette, next to the replace function is the place function. Kind of makes sense, place and replace. The place function will add this object to the current menu. Only problem is it added it on top of all of the other elements. If I go back to the layers palette, you'll see that sure enough, it's the top element in the list, so I can't see my buttons anymore. So the goal is to get this backdrop to be indeed the backdrop and not the foredrop. Well, once again, since Encore treats layers like objects, I can tell it to simply place this at the bottom of the stacking order. If I go up to the object menu, I can tell Encore to arrange the layers such that you send this to the very back. And this matches the other applications. Bring to front will bring it all the way forward. Bring forward will bring it one step forward. So if it's at the very back, it'll bring it up one layer. Send backwards will do the reverse, and send to back will send it all the way to the bottom of the list, just ahead of the backdrop. That's important as well. It'll never replace the background layer because it has to always have a background layer, but this will sit in front of that and you won't see the background anymore. So now we have a backdrop behind the buttons, and to edit any menu at any time in Photoshop, you can go up to the menu, say that 10 times fast, and say Edit in Photoshop. This will, if it isn't running already, launch Photoshop. In this case, it'll launch Photoshop CS. And keep in mind that Encore is compatible with Photoshop 7 as well. In this case, Photoshop is asking me whether or not I would like to update the text layers for vector-based output. And the key here is vector-based output. Encore doesn't generate vector-based output. It generates raster-based output. So I'm going to say no. Don't worry about it. And scale this up a little more so we can see what's going on. Well, the menu looks fairly similar. We've got kind of the ghosted gray thing going on, but now we've got these outlines around each of the buttons. These are the highlight areas. In technical terms, they're called subpictures. They are what light up or become visible when that button is selected or clicked on. If we look at the layers palette, sure enough, we have a pretty much exact match to what we had in Encore. We have the background layer, the blue flare layer, which is the real background, and each of the layer sets contains the buttons. Now, when I'm done editing in Photoshop, if I change something, if I modify the background layer, image adjustments, hue saturation, and I'll just change the hue of that background to something else, and click OK. Once I'm done editing, I'm ready to save the file. And when you save this, you're saving it back to the temp file. So I've made my changes, I've saved it, I'll close that, I'll go back to Encore, and my menu is updated immediately. Because we're reading that temp file back in, this means that if you don't like what you did, we can go to the Edit menu and say Undo the edit in Photoshop. And of course, remember, Encore has a history function. Even though it's not in a palette, it's under the Edit menu. You can go backward through your steps if there was something you didn't like. Well, in this case, I pretty much like my changes. I think they suit the purpose fairly well. But these aren't very exciting labels for the text for each of the buttons. One of the other compatibilities between Photoshop and Encore are these text elements. It wouldn't make much sense to bring in buttons all named text, so I can grab the text tool and say, Chapter 1, go on to the next one, Chapter 2, and so on. All right, I'm going to simplify this menu slightly. I'll get rid of the extra row of buttons for the moment, and I really want to rename that other button to Chapter 3. And I'll select all of them and bring them down. But I have a problem. I want to drag select through them, and I keep selecting the background. How do I prevent myself from selecting the background? Fortunately, Encore's Layers palette, much like the Photoshop Layers palette, has a lock column. The second column will let you lock layers that are available to you. Background, by default, is always locked to keep you from editing it, but you can turn that off. And in this case, I want to lock the NTSC Blue Flare layer, the backdrop. That's actually no longer blue, so I should probably rename that as well. All right, I'll go ahead and lock that layer to keep me from selecting it, so that now when I click and drag, I don't select the backdrop as part of the selection. I can drag these down, and that looks much better. Okay, I'm looking at this menu, and the text is a little hard to read. I have white letters, even with the drop shadow on them, I can't really see what they say. Well, in addition to changing what the text says, I can change the formatting of the text. If I grab the text tool or just hit the T key, I can select that text again. And in the character palette, I can specify all the usual formatting functions for this text: font, font weight, overall font size, leading, tracking, and color. This is the one I'm after at the moment. I want to change the color of that text to, let's say, bright red. I can click on this, and we get the usual color picker. I'll choose bright red. But of course, video being picky about color, we want to make sure that we pick one that is NTSC safe. Fortunately, there is a checkbox in the lower left corner that will let you specify only let me pick NTSC safe colors. And you can see a subtle change in the saturation and brightness of the color in the background, but we're just bringing that down a little bit. And once we've chosen the color, I'll just click OK. And Encore will update the color of the text to red, but it doesn't look red at the moment because it's selected. If I deselect that, there we go. Now we have red text. I'd like to do the same thing for the other two. Let me drag through here. Color, red. Of course, it's still checked for NTSC safe. That's good. And I'll do Chapter 3 as well. Okay. With those set, we've pretty much covered basic button creation and menus.
Adobe Acrobat has quickly become one of the most indispensable applications available, setting the standard for document management. Whether you use it for publishing creative work, developing secure government forms, creating engineering plans and PDF files, or the multitude of general business functions, Total Training has the video instruction to help you get the most from Acrobat 6. Our series on Adobe Acrobat is presented by Ted Padova, author of the Adobe PDF Bible, and most certainly the world's foremost authority on all things Acrobat. In addition, our Acrobat training can be customized to offer you exactly the skills you need for the realm in which you work. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Total Training for Adobe Acrobat. I'm Ted Padova, and here in Volume 3 of the Acrobat Essentials, we're going to discuss making your PDF files dynamic by adding interactivity. In this first lesson, I'll show you how to create different actions for bookmarks, links, and page actions. So join me on the desktop and let's have a look.
All right, to begin this session on PDF interactivity, I open the Essentials Volume 3 PDF file. Notice that this screen displays Acrobat Standard. Many of the activities that we can do in creating PDF interactivity in Acrobat can be performed in both Acrobat Standard and Acrobat Professional. If you're a professional user, you'll see a few different tools in the toolbar and some different menu commands, but all that we're going to do here in creating PDF interactivity in Acrobat Standard can be equally applied to Acrobat Professional. Let's click on the Next Page button. We'll move to the first slide.
And what I want to talk about to begin this discussion on PDF interactivity is adding interactive actions with bookmarks, link actions, and page actions, and talk about managing bookmarks and creating some actions associated with them. If you click on the first icon adjacent to bookmark actions, we're going to open up a file. You'll see this employee manual file. Notice that the file opens with the bookmarks displayed. The reason the bookmarks are displayed in the bookmark palette here is due to the settings that were established for the initial view. Just to be certain that you know what's going on with that, let's take a look at the File menu and come down and select Document Properties. We'll open up the Document Properties dialog box and click on Initial View. And you can see in the Show pull-down menu, Bookmarks panel and page are displayed. From the pull-down menu, you have your choices here. If you have bookmarks contained in a document, you want them to be displayed on the initial view, be certain that this is selected. Click OK in the Document Properties dialog box. And we return to the document pane here. Be certain that you save the file with those initial settings, and then each time the file is opened, the bookmarks palette will be expanded in the navigation pane, and the end user will be able to see those bookmarks. Now in this file, you'll see I have a number of bookmarks listed in the bookmark palette. When I click on a bookmark, I'll click on Contents to begin with. Notice at the bottom in the status bar, we're on page 2. When I click on Company Standards, the next bookmark, we jump over to page 4. And as you click on different bookmarks, you'll notice that this order really needs to be rearranged. So in order to do that, we have to move these bookmarks in the bookmark palette in the proper order. So as you look at this list of bookmarks here, notice that Welcome appears in the middle. Actually, I want this below Contents. I'm going to click on Welcome, and you'll notice that that page comes in view over here. I'm going to click and drag this bookmark, and notice when I start dragging, you see this red down pointing arrow. That's an indicator of where you're going to place the bookmark and what position in this palette. As I click and drag up, notice that right now it appears below Contents. I release the mouse button, and the bookmark is reordered. If you want to reorder multiple bookmarks, for example, I have Agreement Form, and then I have Acknowledgement 1 and 2 here. I want to put these at the bottom of my bookmark palette. So I'll click, hold the Shift key down for a contiguous selection between the first and the last. Click again. All three of these bookmarks are selected. Now I'll click and drag down below Notice. All right, next, let's take a look at nesting bookmarks. I have Contents appearing here at the top, and what I want to do is nest all of these bookmarks below the content item so that Contents appears as a parent bookmark, and all the bookmarks below that are child bookmarks. To do so, first of all, I'm going to select all these bookmarks. I'll click on Welcome, hold the Shift key down, come down to the very last bookmark and click so that we have one continuous selection of all the bookmarks in the palette. Now I'm going to click on the top bookmark, move it up. You'll see that little red down pointing arrow, and now move to the left. You see a little flag icon appear over here. When you see that icon appear, release the mouse button, and now the bookmarks are nested as child bookmarks below the content parent. I have Agreement Form as a title over here, and then I have Acknowledgement below that. And I want these two acknowledgement items nested below Agreement. Once again, I'll select these two bookmarks. Then I'll click and drag up, move to the left. You see the flag appear, release the mouse button, and now I have a nesting of parent-child bookmarks in several positions. You'll notice that the bookmarks are expanded. I can click on the little icon adjacent to each parent item to collapse or expand those bookmarks. Now keep in mind that reordering the bookmarks does not affect the page order whatsoever. These are normal bookmarks. To reorder pages, you need what we call structured bookmarks that you might create when you capture web pages. For example, if you capture web pages and each one of those web pages are bookmarked, they are structured bookmarks, and moving them will also relocate the pages. With standard bookmarks like we've created here or were present in this document when it was opened, do not affect the page order. Just the links to the pages are nested in their link order here. And regardless of where you move them, they will not affect the page order in the document. Let's move ahead now and add a little bit of interactivity with bookmarks. I want to talk about creating a couple of actions associated with bookmarks here. Let's move to the very last page in the document by clicking on the last page button. You'll see this little form on page 9, and the user eventually will arrive at this page to fill out this form and complete it. In order to come to this page, you can navigate through the page tools in the status bar or going to next page from a variety of different tools in Acrobat. But we can also put a bookmark here so that the user can jump to this page at any point in time. It would be a little easier for the user to zoom into this form in order to fill it out than have a fit page view as you see here. So to zoom in just on the form, what I'm going to do is move up to the toolbar and select the snapshot tool. And I'm going to create a bookmark to a snapshot. As I move the tool into the document, I'm going to click and open up a marquee right around the area that I want to zoom around and release the mouse button. Acrobat informs us that a snapshot has been taken, and I'll click OK. At this point, we're now going to create a bookmark, so I'll go to the Options pull-down menu and select New Bookmark, and let's call this Form. Then I'll select the bookmark, open up a context menu, and select Properties. And in the Bookmark Properties dialog box, I'll click on Actions. You'll notice by default, Acrobat captured the current page view as the current bookmark. I'm going to delete this bookmark, go to Page in this document here by selecting it, and then click on the Delete button. And then we're going to add a new action. I'll go to the Select Action pull-down menu, click on the down-pointing arrow, and what I want to do is go to a snapshot view. I'll select this item and click on Add. You'll see that the Create View from Snapshot dialog box opens. I'll click OK, and you'll see that Custom is now defined as the snapshot view going to this page. And now let's go over to our bookmark palette. I'll click on another bookmark. You can click on any bookmark that you see in the palette here above Form, and then come back and click on Form, and you see that we're zoomed into the snapshot view. Okay, let's deal with another bookmark action. When we click on Contents, you'll notice that Organization Chart appears at the bottom, and if you want the user to be able to open a document at any point, regardless of what page they're viewing, you can create a bookmark action to do the same thing. Let's create a new bookmark by going to the Options pull-down menu. Click on New Bookmark. Remember, you can always use the modifier key, Command, or Control B, depending on your platform. And in this bookmark, I'm going to call it Org Chart, an abbreviation here. Once again, I'm going to select the bookmark. Keep in mind that it must be selected before you open a context menu. I will now open the context menu, select Properties, and instead of going to a page in this document, we're going to open a secondary document. So what I want to do is, once again, I'm going to delete this item. Keep in mind that every time I create a bookmark, it's capturing the current view. So I'm just going to delete this, and then we're going to go to Select Action and go to the pull-down menu and select Go to a page in another document. Click on Add, and the Go to page in another document dialog box opens. This is where we can determine the behavior for how this document opens. Window set by user preference, that's related to the Open Cross-Document Links preference setting in the Preferences dialog box. If I pull this menu down by clicking on the down arrow, you can see that I can open up the other document in a new window or the current existing window, which means that the current document that's in view will close as the other document opens. Let's just give it a new window here. And now we're going to find the file that we're going to open. So click on the Browse button and open up the file called Org Chart. I'll select that, double click on it or select it and click on the Select button, and then click OK and click Close. And to test the link, select the hand tool over here, click on Org Chart as my bookmark. You'll notice that the Org Chart file opens. Now I want to return back to my other document, and rather than deal with a bookmark, I'm going to create another kind of action item called a page action. To do this and make it operate properly, the first thing I'm going to do is close that manual file. So let's go to the Window menu. You'll see that Employee Manual is open. I'll select it, and then let's go to the little close box in the top right corner and close the document. Yes, we want to save it because we already have our bookmark links in it. Let's click Save. And now I'm going to create what we call a page action that's going to open up the employee manual file. To do so, I'm going to select the Pages tab over here. Let's click on Pages and open that. And on this page, it's only one page in the document. I can associate a page action to any page that I want. I'll go to the Page palette, click on the page, and open a context menu. So I'll right-click on Windows or Control-click on the Macintosh, select Page Properties. In the Page Properties dialog box, I'll click on the Actions button over here. Our first decision is what we call the trigger. It can be either on a page open. That means that when the page opens, the action is invoked. From the pull-down menu, I can also choose Page Close. And in this particular example, what I want to do is open another file when this document closes. So I'll select Close. And then we want to go to a page in another document. So from the pull-down menu for the action type, let's click on the down arrow, select the second item here that says go to a page in another document. And now I'm going to add that action to my actions list down here. So I'll click on the Add button. And what I want to do with this document is to, from the pull-down menu, select Existing Window, which means that as this document closes, the other document opens in the same window area. I click on Existing Window, and now I need to find my file. I'll click on the Browse button, and in my Lesson 1 folder, I want to open up the file entitled Employee Manual. I'll select that PDF document, and I'll either double-click on it or click on the Select button. And the next item I'll choose is the page number. In this particular case, I want to go back to the Contents page, which resides on page 2. So I'll click in the field box adjacent to the word Page here, type in 2, and click OK. And then in the Page Properties dialog box, I'll click Close. And now I'm going to save the file, update it. So I'll go to the File menu, select Save. And at this point, when I close this document, the other employee manual document should open on page 2. Let's try that. We'll click on the little close box in the top right corner, and there is my other document on page 2. So as you can see, with the combination of bookmarks and page actions, you can help users navigate through a collection of PDF documents that you can store on a CD-ROM or distribute to users via email. Let's close this document. We'll return back to our slide. Let's now talk about some link actions. I'm going to the button adjacent to this title here that says Link Actions, and I'll open up a document, and you can see that this document contains some comments. If you open the File menu and come down to this area where we have printing controls, you'll notice that we can print the file, and we can also print the file with comments. If you want the user to print this document actually with comments, then rather than have the user select that option from the File menu, you can create a link action that will execute the Print with Comments command. To do that, we need to access the Link tool. In Acrobat Standard, if you go to the Tools menu, let's open that, and let's go to the Advanced Editing menu command and select Show Advanced Editing Toolbar. And I'll take that toolbar, move it up to the toolbar well and dock it. And I will click now on the Link tool, and let's draw a link right around this text at the bottom that says Print with Comments. So I'll open up a rectangle. When I release the mouse button, the Create Link dialog box opens. Now notice I have the Custom Link radio button selected here. We're going to create a custom link. Let's click on the OK button, and now let's click on Actions. And for the action, what I'm going to do is, as I pull this menu down, you can see all the different actions type. Many of these we've discussed already. Let's select the item that says Execute a Menu Item. I'm going to select that item and click on the Add button. Now there's a major distinction here between Windows usage and Mac usage with executing menu item selections. On Windows, this dialog box opens. On the Macintosh, you'll execute a menu item by selecting that menu option from the top level menu bar. So in this particular example, I'm using Windows. What I'm going to do is open the File menu. If you're on the Macintosh, you will go up to the Acrobat File menu and open that menu and come down to Print with Comments. Let's select that item and click OK. And now let's click Close on this dialog box. And when you get your hand tool, let's come over to this rectangle that we've created down here and click on that item. And the Summarize Options dialog box opens. You'll notice in the top portion of the dialog box here, you have a variety of radio button selection choices here for printing this document. The default is to print the document with comments with sequence numbers on separate pages. You can choose to print comments only or document with comments and connector lines. I'll leave this at the default and then click OK. And now we see the print dialog box. If you have a printer attached to your computer, you can exercise the print command by clicking OK down here, print the file off, and then you can see how this document is printed along with the display of comments. By creating a link button, you can make this a lot easier for an end user to print the file as you might expect them to be able to print it without having them navigate to menu options. And that would hold true for a variety of different menu options that you can select by creating link buttons to help your documents be a little bit more interactive for users. I'll cancel out of this dialog box here, and you can choose to save this file if you want to keep your updates active, or simply close it without saving, and we'll return back to slide 1. As you can see with Acrobat Standard, you can create a lot of different kinds of interactive items right within the program using bookmark actions, link actions, and page actions.
For Mr. Bear and his amazing gambling jokes. Take it away, Mr. Bear.
A woman can't decide what number to play at the roulette table. Someone suggests she play her age, so she puts her money on 35. The wheel spins and 43 comes up. She screams and faints. Why would you go to a casino in a Central Asian country? To bet. To bet. How do you get a sweet little 80-year-old lady to curse? Get another sweet little old lady to yell, bingo!
Ha! Bingo indeed. And now that we're all winners, let's check out the next lesson. The topic of this next lesson is panoramas and PDF slideshows. And here to help me introduce things is the official spokesbeing for the PDF format, Petey the Elf. Hi, Petey.
Hi, Deke. Nice gambling theme you got going on here. But aren't you afraid of offending some of our customers?
No, Petey, we're not advocating gambling. It's just an excuse to tell some terrible puns and play a few games.
So you're not really taking wagers, eh?
Well, we can if you want to. I'll bet you $10 you can't jump up and touch this meat that I have hanging here from this hook.
No, Deke. I'd like to take your bet, but the stakes are too high.
That's all, folks.
You've been a great audience.
Try the veal.
If you can reach it. Ah.
Few people think of Photoshop as a vector-based drawing application. In fact, many of you may not even know what a vector-based drawing application is. It's all about drawing simple shapes or complex objects that you can reshape, resize, and revamp without fear of degrading their quality. Because with the exception of people on reality shows and Jerry Springer, nobody's a fan of degradation. So with a big hoop, hoop, hoop out to my peeps, let me show you what I mean.
So there you have it, just a brief glimpse of what it's like to experience a total training series. And remember, everything we sell comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee to ensure that you're fully satisfied with the product. If you're interested in finding out more, visit our website at www.totaltraining.com. Until we meet again, on behalf of Total Training, I'm Brian Maffett, and I'll see you on the desktop. Thanks for watching.